Good morning, everyone. It is about 10 o'clock right now, and we are going to get started. So I would like to invite Assessor Carmen Chu to join us shortly. Welcome, everyone, to the Office of the Assessor's First Digital Family Wealth Forum. As you may know, the Family Wealth Forum is an annual financial education event put forward by our elected official, Assessor Carmen Chu, since 2017. We have served over 1,300 families so far, and we are honored to continue to support you and your families through the pandemic. Today, we will be joined by estate planners, CPA, financial planners, and experts to help answer your questions. Before we begin, I would like to go over a few housekeeping tips with you. We are committed to serving all populations, so we are offering Spanish and Chinese interpretation today. If you prefer to listen to those languages, please go ahead and select the language channel you prefer at the bottom of your screen. Click on the Earth icon and select Cantonese or Spanish. There's also a Q&A function that is located at the bottom of your screen. At any point you have any questions, please type it in and we will try to address it during the webinar. If we happen to run out of time, we will follow up with you afterwards. I will now ask Vivian to explain in language so that all of our participants can get settled in their channels. Vivian, please go ahead. Thank you, Vivian. Mario, can you please explain in channel so that our attendees can get settled? All right, thank you so much, Mario. Before we get started, I just want to remind our panelists to please mute yourself as well as stop your video until it's time for you to present, so that I feel like some of the guests are letting us know that there's a little bit of echo going on. So please go ahead and mute yourselves and stop video until it is time for you to present for your sessions. May I now ask our visionary leader, Assessor Carmen Chu, to give the opening remarks before she jumps into presenting your questions to our financial experts and to kickstart session 1, Personal Finance Management.
Thank you so much, Annie. Good morning, everybody. I hope you are ready for a morning of financial literacy and good information. I just really want to say thank you to all of the folks who've helped to make this event happen, first and foremost. I know that we're going to, of course, try our best to make sure that this format is as helpful as possible, but just please be patient with us, especially as we start to experiment with new technologies, and hopefully this will be a good way for us to relay information, especially during COVID-19. So again, I want to really thank everyone for joining us this morning at our first ever Digital Family Wealth Forum. I think, as Annie had mentioned previously, we had first started this program back in 2017 because as we were out and about in the community, we kept on hearing questions from neighbors from all across the city about how they should be planning for the future. And it wasn't just about, you know, if I've got a house, what should I do with it? But it was also about what I need to be doing for my own personal finances to be able to achieve big goals in the future, whether it's education, buying a home in the future, or other things. And so we really wanted to put together good information to our San Francisco residents and beyond to be able to benefit from hearing from many of our experts. I think especially right now, as we are in COVID-19 scenario, we had originally planned for a May in-person Family Wealth Forum. We really wanted to make sure that we brought credible financial information straight to you. This is incredibly important because especially during this time, we have heard so much about scams that might be happening. We have heard a lot of other kind of unreliable information that people are trying to understand, try to figure out for themselves. And what we really wanted to do was to bring a program together today that addressed some of the big concerns that we're hearing about, especially with COVID-19. So today we're going to be talking about a number of different things. Number one, we're talking about personal finance. We want to make sure that we bring our CPA and financial planning professionals forward to talk to you about what you need to know in terms of personal financial management, what is in the CARES Act, for example, and how do we maximize tax benefits and other financial considerations, especially during this time. The second part, or second hour of our program, is going to focus around resources for families, for homeowners, for individuals, people who really need assistance, especially at this time. And so we're going to be joined by Shannon, who's with Home Ownership SF, and she'll be able to share more information with you there. And then finally, we do want to make sure that we're focusing on this topic of estate planning and advanced healthcare directives and what kinds of information and documents you need to pull together right now to plan for the future. This is really, really important, especially now when we're dealing with a global health pandemic. You know, I think most of us are doing our best to try to stay home, to try to stay safe, and to help protect ourselves and our loved ones. But at the same time, none of us will know if we might contract COVID-19 and what that consequence may be. So I think for all of us, it's really just a good reminder that it's a good time for us to be planning for the future as well. I think, as Annie mentioned, we've served over 1,300 families, and I know that we had actually hundreds of people register for this event today. So again, we really do hope that we're going to be able to provide a good program for you so that you have the first step forward, being able to plan for the future. Before I introduce our first panelist and kind of get right into the questions, I do want to thank my team at the assessor's office who have really worked hard to try to transition this program online. So of course, my team, Vivian Poe, Holly Lung, Annie Ma, Erin Huey, Adrian Yan, and of course, Al Barber are all here and available to help not only with the technical, but also some of the questions that might come forward later from folks who are participating. So thank you all for joining us, and I'm going to jump right into introducing our first workshop's participants. And so, as I mentioned, we're going to be talking about personal financial management in our first session, and I am so excited to be able to have Francis Samion and Heather Liston join us. And so let me read you just quickly their bios, because they've got an impressive history and great passion, and I want to make sure that you know about them. So Francis is a San Francisco-based CPA. He's currently part of the finance team at RIA Family Office. He's worked for mid-sized Bay Area public finance or accounting firms for much of his life, specializing in private equity and venture capital clients. But on his spare time, Francis really enjoys volunteering. He really helps with San Francisco's Financial Planning Day, but not only that, he helps consistently with tax aid to make sure that he's providing and giving back to the community on weekends and helping folks who might not have access to services the way other people would. Outside of work, you're going to see that he loves to do a lot of reading, but he's also learning to play the ukulele. So I don't know that he's going to be able to grace us with his ukulele skills today, but hopefully we'll be able to learn more from the financial side of his mind. And then finally, we also have Heather Liston, who's joining us today. She's a certified financial planner and an enrolled agent at UC Berkeley Extension. She is a program director for personal financial planning and accounting. She also teaches courses in income taxes, retirement planning, and employment benefits. She is vice president at Hargrave Fiduciary Advisors doing fee-only financial planning, and she has a private practice as a tax preparer. Her writings on retirement plannings, employee benefits, and other topics have appeared in things or entities like bankrate.com, Harvard Business Communications Letters, and elsewhere. So again, as you can see, we have two really great distinguished guests who've joined us. So welcome, Heather, and welcome, Francis.
Thank you very much for the warm introduction, Carmen.
Thank you. Hi, Heather. Thanks for joining us as well.
Good morning.
So I do have a first question, so I'm going to jump right into it. We have a question about Congress's act. So I think, as you know, under COVID-19, there's been a lot of activity that's been happening in terms of programs that are available to individuals. And so one of the questions we received was around the CARES Act, Coronavirus Aid, Relief, and Economic Security Act. People want to know about what kind of economic repercussions there are associated with it. Are there any programs or things that they should know about relating to this? And I think, Heather, you're going to take the lead on answering that question.
Sure, thank you. The CARES Act, like most acts affecting the IRS is quite complicated and has lots of pieces to it. But the ones I think are most important for you are people whose income in 2019 was less than $99,000 have probably already gotten a stimulus check of $1,200 in the mail. If you didn't get that $1,200 check and your income is not very high, check on it. You can go to irs.gov and find a link and see why you haven't gotten it yet. There are also loans available for small businesses and a few other important things. If you have a flexible spending plan or a health savings account, those are both ways to save tax-free money for medical expenses. Two important changes came under the CARES Act. You can once again buy over-the-counter medications with those. For the last 5 or 6 years, you've not been able to, but now you can use that money to buy things like aspirin and other things you might need at the drugstore. And for the first time ever, you can use those two plans to buy feminine hygiene products. So that's something I want to make sure people know about. That was never true before. Also, if you realize now that your health insurance or your FSA or your plans may not have the amounts you want or the type that you want, your employer is allowed to let you change now mid-year to put more or less money in your flexible spending plan for medical expenses and to change your health insurance if the employer offers more than one plan. Another thing you should know about is you can withdraw or borrow money from your 401k this year without penalty. You always have to pay tax if you take money out of a tax deferred account, but there's no extra penalties now, even if you're not 59 and a half yet. So those are some of the key points I think that affect individuals.
Can you tell us a little bit, Heather, about the differences while we're at it on this topic around 401ks and IRAs? Because I know that this is often a point of questions that people typically will raise.
Yes, in general, a 401k or any other workplace plan is a great thing to be a part of. You can defer money and save taxes on it. And when I say workplace plan, the most common type is a 401k. But the same thing is true for a 403b, a 457, a simple IRA, a SEP IRA, a 401a, or a deferred compensation plan. Those are all workplace plans. And if you don't have a plan like that at work, you may well be saving through an IRA, either a traditional or a Roth IRA. So some of the big differences are that in a workplace plan, you can withhold more. You can withhold up to $19,500 of your salary in the tax deferred plan. If you're over 50, you can withhold another $6,500, which adds up to $26,000 altogether, I think. Whereas if you've got an IRA, you can put in up to $6,000 per year and up to $7,000 if you're over 50. So if you have a choice of either, do the workplace plan because you can save more.
Mm-hmm. So Heather, can you also expand on this one piece, because there's a difference when we're talking about whether something is is pre-tax or after-tax contributions. Can you just clarify for those two items?
Yes, if you put money into your 401k, most commonly, or into a traditional IRA, it's usually pre-tax money. So you put money in, you don't get taxed on it now, which saves you income tax in the current year. The year that you put the money in, that money is sheltered. When you take that money out later, when you're retired, you pay income tax on it then. But that's good because you haven't paid tax for years, so you've been able to save more money. And also you're probably in a lower tax bracket when you retire. So that's what we call tax deferred, putting pre-tax money into one of those accounts, paying tax when you take it out. There's a few other types of accounts where you don't save taxes now, but you save a lot in the long run. Mm-hmm. Specifically the Roth IRA. If you put money in your Roth IRA this year, you will not save any taxes this year. You'll just put in after-tax money. But as that money grows over the years, if you've got it invested, it'll earn income, dividends, interest, capital gains growth. Whenever you take that money out, you pay zero tax on that. So mm-hmm. Both plans are good. If your 401k offers an option where you can put some pre-tax and some Roth, I usually do a little of both because both plans are really good.
Heather, is there an income criteria for Roth IRAs?
Yes, you can't, I think we've got it up on the screen there. If your adjusted gross income is more than $139,000 and you're single, or more than $206,000 and you're married filing jointly, you cannot contribute directly to a Roth IRA. Another important point about that, if you are married filing separately, you can't contribute to any kind of IRA. So take that seriously. If someone says, oh, you should file separately, you probably shouldn't. But in any case, most people file either single or married filing jointly. So there are income limits, and there are lower income limits for a traditional IRA. But if you have a high income and you would like to contribute to a Roth IRA, call your bank and you use this magic word. You say, I want to do a backdoor Roth, and they will help you do it. A backdoor Roth is a code term for how do I get money into a Roth IRA even though I have a high income. We'll try to explain the details here, but if you talk to a finance professional, they can help you do that.
Got it. So just speaking a little bit about kind of retirement, I think especially under COVID-19 right now, I think a lot of folks are strapped in terms of cash flow. And so whether we're talking about having a disruption in job because the employment has gone away, either people are temporarily or permanently laid off, or for many people who have businesses, especially with the shelter-in-place order and not all businesses being able to open, there is really a need to sort of figure out the way to make it through, right? And so people have been trying to figure out, do I take out loans? Should I be pulling money back from stocks and investments? Should I be taking money out from retirement funds? Those kinds of things, right? And also, should I stop contributions to some of these areas, especially when I've got more immediate needs right now? Can you talk a little bit about kind of what people should be considering or thinking about in that way?
Sure. Everything is easier if you have a lot of money, right? Including you can shelter yourself from risk if you have a lot of money. Like if you had all you needed right now to retire on and live on for the rest of your life, then you don't need to invest. You could keep it all under your mattress and not take any risk at all. Most of us are not in that situation though. So we do need to invest some money in order that it can grow in the long run. The problem is we don't know exactly how the timing works out. So probably right now you need more cash than usual. Not everybody, but many people, especially if you've lost your job or something like that, you need more money available in cash or in your checking account so you can use it easily. So I would say try to have a little bit bigger cash nest egg right now than you normally do. But I wouldn't give up on investing completely. In particular, what Carmen just said about should we maybe not contribute to our 401k for a while, try not to do that. Try not to stop contributing. There's this human nature that we do the opposite of what's good for us sometimes when it comes to money. We see the stock market falling overall and we think, oh no, I don't want to be involved in the stock market. I'm going to stop contributing. I'm going to stop saving. The problem is when the stock market is falling, that actually means prices are low. And ideally you want to buy when prices are low. It's like buying things on sale. So, and we have the opposite reaction when things are high. We think, oh, the stock market's doing great. I'm going to buy more and more. So we buy things at the top rates. So the best way to manage this is if you can spare any cash from your daily household budget, absolutely keep contributing to your 401k. Keep saving that tax money and keep saving that money. And this period of time when stocks are relatively low, you'll be buying low, buying cheap. So you'll have more potential for gain in the long run. So try not to stop contributing and try not to borrow or cash out your 401k if you don't have to. Now, if you've lost your job and you have no money for food, then the relief in the CARES Act does allow you to take your money out without penalty. But
Right.
It's not a great plan because you'll lose the benefit of the long time savings.
And Heather, kind of related, piggybacking off of that question, someone had asked, should I hold back my retirement plan when the market is crashing, right? What do I do with my stock and bond investments if I'm planning to retire?
It's all about timing. Yeah, if you've got a long time until retirement, you want to be in stocks mostly because over the long run, they do well. People usually start shifting their portfolio to something a little more conservative as they approach retirement. So as you get older, people start putting less money into stocks and gradually moving more into bonds and cash, which are a little bit safer. They're not likely to crash, but they also don't grow much over the long run. So that seems like a reasonable plan. Gradually shift your holdings from stocks into bonds and cash. Don't do it suddenly, because if you try to guess the perfect day to do it and sell all of your stocks in one day, you will guess wrong. So do it gradually and don't give up all your stocks because you need some growth over time. Bonds and cash are not going to grow.
Got it. So the next question that we have is related to Social Security income. And I know this is a question that I want both Heather and Francis to weigh in on. And the question is whether or not Social Security income is taxable. And are there ways to lower your household income to qualify for the federal stimulus credits?
How about I'll jump in with the taxable question and then we'll turn it over to Francis. So the answer is your Social Security might be taxable, but never all of it. So if you have if Social Security is your only income, it's not taxable. But if you're getting Social Security and you have investment income or you're still working and so you've got other sources of income, then it probably is partially taxable. So if your income is over $32,000 a year, if you're married, or $25,000 if you're single, half of your Social Security income will be taxable. And if your income is over $44,000 a year, 85% will be taxable. Now, that does not mean you're paying 85% tax. It just means that whatever your normal tax rate is, if it's 10 or 12 or 24%, that will be applied to 85% of your Social Security.
And then Heather, just to clarify, when you said 32,000, is that inclusive of the Social Security income?
It's a little bit of a complicated equation you do. It's inclusive of half of your Social Security. There's a little equation you do where you add half your Social Security to your other income. You add back a couple of things. It's called your modified adjusted gross income. But this is a pretty good rough guide. And you'll notice these are relatively low salary numbers, especially for California in 2020. That's because these thresholds were set in 1983 and 1993, and they have been deliberately not indexed for inflation. That way, gradually, more and more people every year pay income tax on their Social Security.
I see. Francis, did you want to jump in?
I think Heather's done a fantastic job of covering the Social Security portion of things. I think I can definitely jump in on how to lower your AGI or household taxable income. And I think it's probably 1 or 2 slides down, I think. Yes, perfect. So I think one of the things that I want to clear up right now is that all the discussions about essentially like the economic impact payments, the $1,200 that maybe attendees have read about, that's based on either your 2018 or 2019 tax information, whether you had filed, depending on whether you had filed the information early or not. I believe now that we're past the July 15 deadline, information that's going to be, I believe that as Congress works on some other type of package they're going to work on, it may very well be based on the 2019 information. So the information that I'm going to share here as to how to lower your household income is really going to be based on how you can lower your household income for 2020 and forward. And I think that Heather already covered a good portion of these things. And so it's going to sound like, I'm going to sound sort of like a half-broken record in the sense that—
Francis, you can never hear this stuff enough.
Covering pretty much the accounts that she's already mentioned, including the traditional 401k. What's that? Did I lose you?
Oh no, you're fine. I was just saying you can never hear this information enough, so feel free.
Gotcha. Oh, gotcha. I listed out the different accounts in terms of the amount of dollar limits going down. So your sort of your biggest bets start at the top, going all the way down. Your traditional 401k, as Heather had mentioned, has an annual limit right now as of $19,500. Depending on your age, you may qualify for essentially catch-up contributions. Now, she mentioned workplace retirement plans, but then what if you're self-employed? Are these plans still available to you? And the short answer is yes. There's a whole range of different plans, but if you want to take advantage of the same higher 401k limit, especially if you're a solopreneur or maybe a small business plan, small business plan in the sense that maybe it's like you and a spouse working together in your own business, consider setting up a solo 401k to take advantage of these higher limits. The next one that I have here is the traditional IRA. It stands for individual retirement account, and similar thing. You set it up not so much with an employer plan, but separately. And this is something that not everybody, I think, is either aware of or has considered, which is that if you're married and only one spouse is earning an income, you can actually consider setting up and contribute to an IRA for the non-earning spouse. And so if you've read articles about it, maybe you've come across the term spousal IRA, It's not a special type of IRA. It's really just this concept of setting up an IRA for the non-earning spouse. The next one, especially as COVID is ongoing still, we've got the health savings account. There are different limits depending on the plan that you've signed up for, and depending also on your age, there may very well be catch-up contributions available to you. I've listed out the figures on the slide, so I'm not going to read them out in this case. And last, again, same thing Heather had mentioned earlier, consider the flexible spending account. The thing to think about though is that if you've already signed up for the health savings account, you'll want to be mindful of the types of expenses that you can run through an FSA, in this case, the flexible spending account, because if you use it in tandem with a health savings account, the FSA becomes what's considered a limited flexible spending account. And what that means is typically if you did not have an HSA, you can use the FSA for pretty much your run-of-the-mill, co-payment costs, drug costs. So essentially your health, vision, and dental, you could typically run those through. But if you're using an HSA and an FSA together, the FSA can only be used for vision and dental expenses. So that's something to keep in mind.
So Francis, actually, I did see a question that came in from one of the folks who are participating who just wanted to know generally, what can you spend typically in an FSA versus an HSA? So I think you sort of mentioned it, but it'd be worthwhile to just say again, what typically can you spend out of an HSA and FSA? And then as you mentioned, if you have both, what does that mean? One more time.
So if typically the two, in terms of like what you can spend it on, Congress has continually, I think, expanded on just like the types of expenses that you can spend it on. I can't tell you right now all the list of expenses, but typically if it's a matter of like expenses you have otherwise incurred to see your doctor, some type of like say physical therapy. I'm just quoting examples off the top of my head here. Drug costs, for example. These are things that you typically be able to run through your HSA and your FSA. But if you have both, in this case, you wouldn't be able to run the expenses that I just mentioned through your FSA because you'd only be limited to your dental and vision expenses.
I see.
And you can still do that with the HSA as well. It's just that when you have them in tandem, the limitations start to apply for the FSA in this case.
Got it. And I think Heather wanted to add something.
Yeah, thanks. The list of things that you can count as medical expenses for the HSA and the FSA is quite long. Doctors and medical and dental and prescription drugs and now over-the-counter drugs are a big part of it. But if you have questions about specific things, Publication 502 is an IRS publication. It's a document you can just Google and get it off the web. That lists every item. Like if you're wondering, oh, my doctor said I should get a massage or I should install a swimming pool, those kind of gray areas, Publication 502 is your final answer. And one sort of fun fact about this that I just checked for a client, she is buying long-term care insurance and she wondered, could she use one of these plans to pay the insurance premium on her long-term care? The answer is you can pay for that out of your HSA, not your FSA. So if you have a health savings account, pay your insurance premium for your long-term care insurance, and in some cases for your health insurance. And then you can do that tax-free, which is great.
Got it. Francis, is there anything else you wanted to add before I had asked that question?
No, I think that these are probably the, in terms of the amount of efforts that people can put into lowering their household income, these are probably like, in terms of the limits that we're talking about, in terms of like the accessibility, these are probably the ones that most people will want to take a look at.
Got it. Thank you for that information. So Heather, there's a question that panelists or folks have asked, participants have asked, and the question is, does it matter if I transfer property before my required minimum distribution age or after? And are there taxes on inheritance?
Oh, let's take the second part first because it's easier. Are there taxes on inheritance? Very likely not. California no longer has a state inheritance tax. A few states do. So check, if you're in a different state, check that specifically, but California, no. Federally, there is an estate tax, but it doesn't affect you until you have more than about $11.5 million, or if you're married, more than $23 million. So for most of us, there we go, we got the numbers up. For most of us, no problem at all. Now, if you do have more than $23 million, call an estate attorney. There are many good ones. I think there's one speaking later, and they'll find ways to shelter your income so it doesn't affect you either. So essentially, you usually don't need to worry about inheritance taxes. And then the other part was about transferring assets before and after. Could you read that again?
Sure. It doesn't matter if I transfer property before or after my minimum distribution age.
It depends partly on what you mean by transfer property, but let's see, if your required minimum distributions now begin at 72. For many years, that was 70 and a half. The Secure Act, which came out a few months before the CARES Act, changed that. So required minimum distributions begin at age 72.
So maybe Heather, just step back for just a moment. Can you explain to folks what the minimum distribution age is first?
Yes, that means if you have saved money in a traditional IRA or 401k, the government doesn't want you to leave it in there forever. So when you turn 72, you have to start taking some money out each year. There's a formula based on your life expectancy and how much money you have. So you will find out that when you turn 72, you have to start taking some money out each year. What that means is you just move it from one account to another, but the key thing is it becomes taxable at that point. So if you have a very high income when you're over 72, you want to spread that out as slowly as possible so that you're not paying a lot of tax every year. So when you turn 59 and a half, you are allowed to take money out of those accounts without penalty. When you turn 72, you have to take money out. So between those years, 59 and a half to 72, you're completely flexible. You can take money out and make it taxable, or you can leave it where it is. So that's a really good time to sort of be actively managing your accounts and thinking about how much tax do I want to pay this year so it doesn't become a big burden later all at once.
Yes. Yeah, and I think this question, when it says, does it matter if I transfer property before or after the required minimum distribution age? It's not really clear what the question is trying to get at, I think. But if I'm understanding the person, it may be a question about whether they should transfer like a real estate property before or after the minimum distribution age. And my understanding is it doesn't really have an impact necessarily. The minimum distribution age is about when you are required by the federal government to take money out of those retirement accounts. That's unrelated to when it is appropriate in your situation to transfer a piece of property. So
correct.
That's a little bit different. Yeah.
Yeah, it is unrelated. The only thing would be your required minimum distributions do start triggering tax effects. So if you're doing something with your real estate or other property that's going to trigger taxes, maybe talk to an advisor at that point and look at the overall picture and see, am I creating a particularly big tax burden in a particular year? But
Absolutely.
Otherwise, no connection.
Absolutely. One question that people have put in here is, what are the best options to finance my child's college education? So Francis, can you take that one?
Yeah. This one I actually enjoyed, I think, like thinking about because I realized that it also just covered so much of what we'd already talked about, which is that so much of the things that you do for sort of like yourself and future you when you're trying to plan for your own retirement can actually benefit your own child's eligibility for financial aid as well, actually. And I think that if we go to the next slide, you'll probably see what I'm talking about. And the way that I sort of went through this is the amount of efforts that you would be sort of like going out of your way to take the steps anyway. So I think regardless of like what's in front of you, I think you should always be looking at scholarships and grants that's available for your child. I think that one thing that maybe more and more people are thinking about is also community college for the general education portion requirements of a 4-year degree. Community colleges typically have transfer agreements with 4-year schools. And one example I listed out here was the University of California.
Yeah.
So I think, it's one of those things where I know for a lot of high schoolers, typically in like their junior and senior year, they're looking at all these things. They're asking all these questions. Parents are going across the country trying to figure out where do I want my kid to go? And there's an option that essentially, it can definitely bring down the cost when you think about 2 years worth of university, as well as potentially like housing and living costs for your child. So that's a big chunk, I would argue. The other one is also, again, one of those like things you can do that can benefit you and benefit your kid, which is for FAFSA, if you actually pay down debt as well as take the steps to lower your household income that we saw on the other slide, like contribute to your 401k, contribute to an IRA, an HSA, an FSA. All those things can actually help with the eligibility because there are certain things that don't get considered into the financial aid formula. One of them is the primary residence equity, unsecured debt like credit card debt and personal loans. And I'll give an example in a bit. And I also mentioned retirement plan assets. So if, say, for example, when you're filling out FAFSA, they typically ask you, how much of your assets do you have today? And in my example, let's say you have $10,000 in cash and then $10,000 in credit card debt. Now, if you filled out that FAFSA and then you fill out that you have $10,000 in cash, they're not gonna be concerned that you also have $10,000 in credit card debt. They're just gonna see you have $10,000, and it is going to affect your financial aid formula. I couldn't tell you how much, but it is going to affect it in a way where you are going to seem like you can contribute more to your child's costs than you probably could realistically. One of the things you can do is, surprisingly, you net it out. If you took the $10,000 in cash and you paid off the debt, you essentially made yourself, at least on paper, $10,000 poorer as it relates to the financial aid formula. And then the last one, and I think this is probably something that most people have like come across, heard about, and in terms of efforts and sort of, I call it the going out of your way to really put an effort in, it's the 529 plan. And one of the things that I've found also that people don't realize is that I think people are familiar with GoFundMe and like, hey, I want to do this trip, or I've got this big medical expense that's come up. And you can actually do the same thing with a 529 plan. And I actually recommend this to my friends because I think I'm sort of at the age where my friends are getting married and having kids, and I tell them all about this thing actually, which is set up a 529 plan and then just send me the link. I'll put in what I can, and then in that case, I basically have sort of contributed to your kid 18 to 20 years down the road if you invest the money properly. So I mentioned in the first bullet point, instead of toys and other small gifts, consider asking friends and family to contribute to the child's 529 account. And again, most sponsors, like I've had a friend who set it up with, and it's strictly not a recommendation, but it's just from one of my friends set her account up with Fidelity. And so they gave her a link, and then she just used the link to email it to some friends. And then it's like, hey, contribute to my kid's 529 plan. The contribution limit, if some people are curious about that, is typically limited up to the GIF annual exclusion every year. For 2020, it is $15,000. So if you've got an especially generous grandma, grandpa, aunt, or uncle, it can be their time to shine. There's definitely more specifics as to, there's a term called front loading, which is you can essentially contribute up to 5 years in 1 year. It's more complex than just doing the 15,000 per year, and maybe it's asking too much of people right now, but it is an option that is available also. And then the last bit, and probably the most important bit, is invest the money you have in the 529 accordingly for the time horizon you're looking at. Because if your child right now, say your child is 5 years old, or some type of age where they're not quite yet at the college level, you definitely don't want that the funds you've kind of like gone out and collected from your friends and family to just be sitting in cash, because it's not going to be as much help 5-10 years later when your kid's about to go to college and you've only been earning 0.5% interest on the cash, when you could have been investing it more accordingly and probably gotten a better rate of return.
That's great. So just to recap, Francis, I think those were great ideas. So some tangible things that parents can do in order to start kind of getting ready for their kids. I think one, for education, one is to reduce your income by doing things like contributing to your retirement accounts and other things that are kind of natural ways that you kind of bring down that income level so that you qualify perhaps more for financial aid. Number two, you mentioned, was to pay down debt, because under the FAFSA formulas, they don't really consider your debt. And so if you pay it down, it sort of benefits you because you pay down the debt, but it also reflects then in FAFSA the right way so that you actually they consider what you owe also. And then the last thing you said was to set up accounts that essentially are savings accounts that you can invest in, that kind of grow with your kid until they need to use that funding. Can you just expand just quickly on, are there drawbacks to some of these plans? Because I've heard some parents who have asked a question about, should I just invest it in a stock market, for example, as opposed to opening up a 529? Because it sounds like they can only use it for education, but what if we don't use it, or what if the situations change, etc.? Can you talk a little bit about the pros and cons and what people should be thinking about?
Absolutely. I think that people are right to be concerned about like not knowing quite how much they're going to need. I think it's probably safe to say, given the cost of like a higher education nowadays, it's probably going to be such a small subset of people that are not going to end up fully utilizing whatever amount of money they put into a 529 plan. The benefit about the 529 plan versus, say, investing through a regular brokerage account is that whatever gains you've experienced in the 529 plan, when you take it out and use it to pay for the higher education costs, you're not the gains are not treated as income. So it's strictly in that sense, you're putting money in that you don't get a deduction for, but any types of gains that you experience and then used for the education expenses, you also don't get taxed on. Now, one way that you can definitely sort of like mitigate the risk of like, well, what if, my child doesn't want to go to college? What if my child qualified for so much scholarships and grants that, we didn't need a 529 plan after all. One way that I've seen people mitigate it is that you can set up a 529 plan for the oldest sibling, and if they don't use all of it, or they don't, say like life changes, plans change, you can always reassign a 529 plan. You can always reassign a 529 plan. The beneficiary could very well be their younger brother. There's obviously some more considerations if we're talking about, say, a different, I guess like not so much lineage, but just sort of like, I'm losing the word I have top of my head, where essentially if you were to try and go from like, say, your child to like maybe your grandchild, there are definitely some considerations in there that kind of like fall more into the gift tax planning and estate tax planning considerations. But again, I think that it's probably going to be such a small subset of people that are going to have those issues, because I think right now more people are just trying to come up with the funds typically to pay for college and not end up taking too much loans. And on the topic of loans, if I remember correctly, and maybe Heather like knows the answer off the top of her head, like publication 502, is I believe the 529 plans had been revised a bit where I forget the exact dollar amount. You can take some out to pay for student loans. Is that right, Heather? Or did I just...
You can pay for student loans out of it, including your own. So Francis was talking about the fact that you can transfer it to another family member. If you start a 529 for one child and they don't need it all, you can transfer it to another family member. And this is a part of the IRS code that defines family more broadly than most parts. You can even transfer it to a first cousin if you want, and you can transfer it upwards to a parent or grandparent. So for example, if you're saving money for your child's college and they don't need it all, you can pay off your own loans, or you can go take a class somewhere, get your master's degree later and use that money. That's fine. Another thing about 529s is under current tax law, you can also use $10,000 per year per child for private school. It's not just for college anymore. And one more point I wanted to make, in the original question, I think you said something like, should I just put my money in the stock market instead of in a 529? That's not an either or, because you put it in a 529 plan and then you invest it. So you're putting it in the stock market within the 529. So you do have the potential for good growth in there.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think as Francis had mentioned, you don't want to just put it in there and have it sit in a cash account, right? So I think it was more so that the question was more geared towards, instead of a 529, is it better to have more flexibility by putting it into sort of an independent brokerage account? But I think Francis covered it pretty well in terms of some of the considerations there. And thank you, Heather, for adding to that as well. We're getting to 10:45, and I do have a final question for you, but I've seen that there's a lot of questions coming through, so I do want to make room for that. The last question I have is just a quick one for both you, Francis, and Heather, but I think the path to financial kind of planning and just kind of getting educated about different considerations, it's complex, and people are often stuck because they say, well, where do I even begin and how do I start? Because it's hard, right? And sometimes there's a million resources out there. So based on your professional path and kind of things that you think are helpful for people, can you give us some recommendations on how people can start the journey on financial empowerment and personal growth and personal finance?
Sure. Do you want to start, Francis?
Oh, sure. Yeah. I think I'd put together sort of like my distilled version of like all the resources. The number one that I had is this website called Humble Dollar. And I can't tell you when I came across it, probably 1 or 2 years ago. And I'm just been incredibly impressed with just like how broad the topics that are covered in there, as well as like the in-depth, it's really like this in-depth personal finance resource that nowadays when people ask me for what would I recommend, I just tell them, go to the website. They have guides on all sorts of subjects that you maybe like want to touch on, including retirement, college, investing. And it's not a one-all, end-all. It's not something that's going to answer everything that you may have, but I would argue it does a really fine, good job of it. Like, it just is amazing to me. I think if you're like me, you're also like a big fan of stories. And I've found that The Richest Man in Babylon, I'm pretty sure a lot of the attendees have probably heard this before, but I'm also like trying to include like little snippets of like what my biggest takeaways were from like the 3 next books that I'm mentioning, is that a good savings habit is probably the bedrock of your financial life. I think that everything else really flows from it. And I think that if you have really, you could be an amazing investor, but if you don't have the good savings habit to come up with the capital to actually, you know, put those investing skills to use, it's not going to do you as much good. And I think that's probably one of the things that really has resonated and sat with me. And then again, some of these books, I'm sure you've seen it from like all sorts of different places already. The other one is Your Money or Your Life by Vicki Robin and Joe Dominguez. And it's this idea that money is equal to time, which again, I think people are well aware of, but it is limited and it's also finite, and that's to be intentional with your spending. The last one, Millionaire Next Door. Idea is very simple enough to on the path to wealth. While you're working on it, you essentially have like 1 or 2 options in front of you, which is you can either be rich or you can look rich. And what I mean by that is, it's hard. It's in the same way that I think people are realizing nobody can truly multitask. I think it's a series of like really just putting your focus into one thing at a time. In the same sense, if your goal is to become financially independent, or at least financially secure, it's a lot easier to do it if you're focused on one thing at a time. And those are probably like, you know, my distilled 1-page resources right there for you, and especially the website.
That's fantastic. Thank you. How about you, Heather? What do you think?
I won't try to top those great general books. So I'll say there may be some websites right in front of your face that you don't think about, like irs.gov. They get the final answer. And I tell my tax students, you know, if I ever tell you anything and you find a different answer on irs.gov, you win. And what people may not realize is it's pretty well written also. The answers are all there about taxes, which includes retirement planning. And it's pretty easy to understand. Medicare and Social Security also have pretty good websites. Medicare.gov, and SSA stands for Social Security Administration. When you're getting ready for Medicare, it's very complicated. You have to make a lot of decisions, and it's not easy. So one resource I want to make sure people know about is there's an organization called California Health Advocates. Their acronym is HICAP, H-I-C-A-P. They provide free advice when you're making decisions about Medicare. They have branches in Marin, in San Francisco, and elsewhere. Invaluable tool. Take advantage of it and use that.
Thank you. Actually, I've learned something new here because as I've been sheltered in place, I've actually had to shelter in place with my parents as well. So we're talking through a lot of Medicare conversations with them. And actually, this is really timely because I'm going to go straight to these sites and find out more.
Good. In that case, I'd like to recommend another pair of books. There are some really smart guys who wrote a book called Get What's Yours that's all about details of Social Security, and another one called Get What's Yours for Medicare. And those 2 books are very easy to read, and they have answers to every scenario.
Oh, wow. Thank you. Thank you, Heather. So with that, I'm going to turn it over, I think, to Annie for some assistance in terms of getting to the questions that participants have been asking as we've been talking.
Great. You guys are so timely. I was just going to jump on and interrupt you all to start the Q&A portion. So right now, we just have a question from Long Tran, and this is for Francis. For the FAFSA in your scenario, instead of paying off your credit card, can you pay more into your mortgage? That is your $10K into the principal of your house mortgage, and could that also be your investment house that is not your residence? Thank you.
I appreciate the question, and I'm glad that it's split up in a way where I can actually give a yes and no answer here. If you use the $10,000, in my example, I had $10,000 in cash and $10,000 in credit card debt. If you were to use that $10,000 instead and say you had a mortgage on your primary residence, yes, the effect would be the same. Essentially because your primary residence equity is not counted in your financial aid formula. Unfortunately, when it comes to your investment property, it doesn't quite work that way, because the value of your investment property is going to get counted, but the value of essentially like the mortgage or the debt on that investment property is also not considered the same way that your credit card debt wouldn't be considered. So in this case, if your goal is to essentially make yourself better qualified for financial aid because of the formula and just like the differences that it sort of like looks at, your assets and debt, you're better off either probably paying down the credit card debt because of the high interest rate, and then maybe the primary residence mortgage right after that.
Great. Thank you so much. Here's a question from Anonymous. For Roth 401k, if you leave your job or roll over to Roth IRA, if the financial institution requires you to sell, and isn't that a distribution, will you be taxed if you're under 59 and a half?
No, it's not a distribution. As long as you roll it directly from a Roth 401k to a Roth IRA. Do not tell your employer to mail the money to you and you'll invest it later. Have it done what's called a trustee to trustee transfer. So ask that they send the money directly from the 401k to the IRA. And I'm going to give you, since you asked about that, one little secret tip. Roth IRAs, one of the reasons Roth IRAs are so great is they have no required minimum distributions. So if you have money in a Roth IRA, you can take it out when you want to after you've met certain requirements. You never have to take it out. You can leave it for your children. Oddly enough, Roth 401ks do have required minimum distributions. So when you leave your job, do roll your Roth portion into a Roth IRA.
Great. Thank you for that. We have time for one more question. And this is about student loans. Is there any advice about programs other than deferment forbearance that can help with student loan payments? Are there forgiveness programs for those that are not in education careers?
I'll chime in on the second portion of that, which is sort of the forgiveness options if you're not in education careers. I just want to point out that the careers and jobs that essentially qualify for that are not just limited to education, but it is expanded into, I believe, some other roles, typically within government. I couldn't tell you like all the different roles that would qualify for that, but it is definitely not just education. So I'd hate for people to think that, only teaching jobs would be the ones that would qualify. But at the same time, also, you have to understand that like typically for the forgiveness type loans, they're usually only for the loans also that are from the federal government. So it's not typically your private loans that would also qualify for this. And so really, I think for a lot of people right now, it is having a good understanding of the type of loans that you have and what options are available to you. And sometimes it's asking a lot of people also, but trying to have a conversation with your lender could very well be one good option to you, because right now I think it's no surprise people are under a lot of stress financially and just everything else going on in life. And I think lenders right now are very receptive to conversations.
Great. So it is getting close to the end of session one. So at this point, I want to ask Assessor Chu as well as Heather and Francis to wrap up and any closing remarks.
Sure. So I'll just say thank you, of course, to Francis and to Heather. I think the hour went by incredibly fast because we covered a lot of ground and you also had a lot of different questions. And so I hope the questions and answers were helpful to people, but definitely I think that the recommendations that you both gave in terms of how we can begin our path and journey in terms of financial education is a good one, because it's never too late to start, frankly. And I think the more you read, the more you know. The better that you can engage in conversations and ask even more kind of detailed questions and learn even more the more you go. So I think there's no wrong question. There's always a good time to start, and I hope that this helps people to get on that first step. Thank you, Francis, and thank you, Heather, for taking the time to be with us.
Thank you.
You're very welcome. Thanks for having me.
Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much to Assessor Chu and to the panelists for such an insightful conversation and providing resources for our participants to take away. We will be sharing the recording and slides with you afterwards. A lot of you folks are letting us know that you're unable to assess them, so we'll definitely send those to you and answer any questions that we did not get to during the first session. So at this point, we are going to take a 5-minute break before we begin the second session. During this time, please take a look at the bottom of your screen. There's going to be a poll that's going to be showing shortly. Please go ahead and take your time to fill it out, and we encourage you to give us your feedback about session one. And the poll can be filled out anonymously. So thank you so much. We're going to take our break and we will be back in about 5 minutes. Thank you. Hello, everyone. If you're just joining us, welcome to our first Digital Family Wealth Forum. Before we begin our second session, I would like to let you know that the webinar is being recorded and shared today on YouTube Live, as well as SFGov TV. I will now ask our interpreter, Vivian Poe, to explain in language so that all of our participants can settle in their channels. Great, thank you, Vivian. Hi, Pablo. Can you please also go ahead and explain in language so that all our participants can get settled in their channel, please? Great, thank you so much. Welcome everyone to the Office of the Assessor's first Digital Family Wealth Forum. As you may know, the Family Wealth Forum is an annual financial education event put forward by our elected assessor, Carmen Chu, since 2017. We have served over 1,300 families so far, and we are honored to continue to support you and your families through this pandemic. Before I invite our leader, Assessor Carmen Chu, to start the second session, I'd like to go over a few housekeeping tips with you again. We are committed to serving all populations, so we are offering Spanish and Chinese interpretation today. If you prefer to listen to those languages, please go ahead and select the language channel you prefer at the bottom of your screen. Click on the Earth icon and select Cantonese or Spanish. There is also a Q&A function that is located at the bottom of your screen. At any point you have any questions, please type it in and we will try to address it during the webinar. If we happen to run out of time, we will follow up with you afterwards. Again, I'd like to ask Vivian to explain in language so that our participants can get settled in the channels. Vivian? Thank you, Vivian. Pablo, can you please explain in language so our participants can get settled? Thank you so much, Pablo. And thanks again, Vivian. So right now it's 11:10 and we're gonna get started. So may I ask our fierce leader, Assessor Carmen Chu, to join us in introducing Shannon Wei as we get started with our second session, Financial Assistance for Families. Assessor Chu?
Thank you, Annie, and thank you everybody for either joining us for this session or for continuing on with us. As I mentioned before, we think especially during this time, having access to credible and good financial information is more important than ever. And I'm really, really excited to be able to introduce Shannon, who is going to be joining us for this next session. In particular, the reason this is so important is that I think especially now as we see so many different families and people in the city really struggling, especially with COVID-19, whether it's because of a job loss or because their businesses are on hold. I think it's incredibly important that we try to provide as much financial help as we can. And this session is going to be talking about some of the resources that are available to families and to individuals to be able to plan for the future. And so I want to introduce Shannon before we get going on some of the questions that we've received. But again, for Shannon, she's actually been one of our longest standing partners when it comes to financial education for our citizens. And so I want to just thank Shannon for joining us today. Shannon is the Executive Director for Homeownership SF. She believes that financial education is a way to personal empowerment, and I agree with that absolutely. She ran previously, before being in this role, a successful real estate business for 10 years. She worked primarily with first-time home buyers and small investors, and most of the time she really helped them to make sure that they understood what local home buying assistance programs were and other resources. On top of that, she transitioned to the nonprofit sector in 2011 to advocate for affordable housing after seeing many of her own family and friends really displaced. She's a fourth generation Bay Area resident, so she certainly has seen kind of all of the different transitions that we've had in the Bay Area. She developed the financial services and first-time homebuyer program at the San Francisco LGBT Community Center, and she administered the Lending Circles, a credit-building microloan program in partnership with Mission Asset Fund previously. Shannon served as vice chair for Habitat for Humanity Selection Committee from 2013 to 14 and was on the board of directors for Homeownership SF prior to joining the team as a staff member and now as an executive director. So we're incredibly fortunate to have Shannon join us and to be able to share her experiences and really help us to kind of get good information out there so people can understand what's available to them. So I want to just jump right into this and ask you, Shannon, well, first, welcome, but to ask you also, you know, I understand Homeownership SF has a huge network of different partners, citywide housing counselors, people who provide one-on-one services to family in different neighborhoods. And so I'm wondering from your perspective and on the ground, what are you hearing from families these days? What are some of the big issues that are really arising in particular because of COVID-19?
Well, thank you, first of all, Carmen, so much for inviting me here today. We really value the partnership that we have with the Assessor Recorder's Office. You guys have helped us to get to people who are experiencing financial distress more quickly when more options are available to them. And that's a very important part of the work that we do. So thanks for inviting me to be here today. And also thank you for having this fantastic event.
Thank you.
And, you know, we know it's a challenge to be trying to bring information into the community at this time with all the shelter-in-place requirements. And so I'm just so excited to see these resources being brought to the community at this critical time.
Thank you.
Homeownership SF is we have our members. So we have agencies that are the 5 HUD-approved housing counseling agencies here in San Francisco. So Asian Inc., Balance, the San Francisco LGBT Center, the Mission Economic Development Agency, and San Francisco Housing Development Corporation. And these agencies came together in 2008 with support of the Mayor's Office of Housing to create Homeownership SF as a way for these different agencies, which were serving very different populations and geographies and parts of the city, to be able to come together in response to the foreclosure crisis that was happening at that time. And so, you know, we are really excited by that model and the ability for agencies to work more closely together, not only to ensure that regardless of where you go, that we're having the same standards of service available, but also to really make sure that we are reaching those critical communities and our most vulnerable communities to provide the services. So our member agencies, they're the ones who do the direct services. They provide housing counseling and education and workshops and services. And our role is really to help the coordination and the convening of this network. And also I want to say that we work more broadly speaking with a lot of other agencies in the city. So, you know, we frequently partner with the San Francisco Bar Association and Housing Economic Rights Advocates to help people connect with legal services. We work very closely with the Tenants Union and the Housing Rights Committee and other agencies that provide eviction defense and are helping people to avoid being evicted and displacement. And, you know, it is really that coalition of everyone coming together and understanding the importance of this work and that no one agency can do it alone. We really need to be proactive and very coordinated in terms of our response to ensure that people are able to get the services that they need very quickly. One good thing I would say, if there can, you know, if we can start with maybe a light at the end of the tunnel, is that from the perspective of loan servicers and banking institutions, you know, we know that it took them a while to get on board when we had the 2008-2009 foreclosure crisis happening. And, you know, there has been some infrastructure that has been developed in the meanwhile that, you know, really we are able to tap into at this time. We have seen our loan servicers coming to the table much sooner and, you know, with really valiant efforts to try to help prevent another foreclosure crisis, to work with people who are experiencing financial distress. And, you know, really what we see is that the more open that conversation is, the more that the servicers are understanding what people are going through, you know, where they are experiencing financial distress, particularly related to COVID and the shelter in place, you know, the more understanding and flexible that they can be. You can't get help if you don't ask for it. And so, you know, that's one of the things that we are very involved in trying to do, helping people not only to have the individual support and the education and the resources that they need, helping people who maybe have had some credit issues or maybe are saddled under a tremendous amount of debt or are feeling that they're, you know, having to rely on their credit cards to get through right now. You know, we provide those services, but we can also help work with servicers directly, you know, with the authorization and approval from the homeowner to help to negotiate with banking institutions for your mortgage as well as for other creditors.
So this is really important because I think for many people who are going through a tough time, it feels very much like they're going through that time alone, right? And so it feels very much like this big stress, not only to have to deal with the financial instability, but also having to figure out the solution on their own. And I really want people to understand and to know that we do have this resource here, Homeownership SF, that does have access to, counselors and other people who can help you. And so I really want to make sure people know that, because you don't have to do it alone, and you can get help from people who are kind of doing this day to day and kind of know kind of what to be sharing with you. And so just make sure that folks we're going to send the links and make sure people have access to information. But Homeownership SF is a nonprofit organization that exists to kind of help people through this process. And Shannon, I just wanted to ask you, you mentioned that Homeownership SF or some of your affiliated organizations or part of this collaborative can help with negotiations with banks. So are you and it sounds like you said that a lot of banks are kind of coming to the table faster, or financial institutions are coming faster. So is that what you're kind of seeing on the ground in terms of, if people are asking for assistance, are you seeing generally that the banks are willing to engage in conversation? And it sounds like Homeownership SF is able to kind of provide some assistance with those conversations as well.
Absolutely. I mean, I do think that we're a little bit in the calm before the storm here. We know statistically, as we've looked at, number of delinquencies, people who've been unable to pay their mortgage payment or their homeowners association dues, in March, in April, in May, as compared to July, we are seeing an increase in people who, are struggling. And again, as I mentioned, the sooner that you can reach out to the servicers, we are finding that many of those servicers are absolutely willing to work with people. And not going it alone is a huge thing. This is very, very overwhelming kind of stuff. And oftentimes, just the very basic, being able to get somebody on the phone can be a real challenge for homeowners. And so, the great thing with our housing counselors is that they're able to leverage the contacts that they have, the relationships that they have. So even where we might be struggling to get a response from the loan servicer, we might have a way to go in the back door, or to try to help, encourage that communication to happen, more accurately and consistently. It does require an initial assessment, so the first thing, and one of the reasons why those relationships with the servicers are very much valued by the loan servicers is because they know that, we have met with a client in advance, that we have assessed their situation, and that we're going to be able to quickly and accurately relay what is going on. So the first step, of course, would be to come in and meet with a housing counselor, bringing in the documentation that you have. The counselor can help you sort through that, make sense of it, figure out what is the best game plan here, what's going to be the solution that I would like to proceed with. And then they'll sign a third-party authorization, basically, which is what gives us the ability to talk to the servicers. Obviously, that's confidential information, so it does need the authority to happen. But, we are able to then step in and help guide those conversations, especially for people who may still be working or have other obligations, they're dealing with homeschooling and, family situations. Yeah. Finding the time to be able to do that and follow up and, make sure that we're staying on them, that can be a real challenge. And that's a huge burden that the counselors can really help to alleviate. It doesn't mean we do it all for you. Obviously, there's some participation that will be required on the part of the homeowner to make sure that things are moving forward and to provide documentation upon request, but we really can help guide that process. The other thing that I want to say is really important is that, if we do start seeing foreclosure numbers rise, we will inevitably see a rise of scams that come along with that. And so, there will be people who, are in the business of accepting money to try to counsel or to try to negotiate on the homeowner's behalf. And, that's kind of a big red flag that they are charging, especially if they're saying they want, thousands of dollars up front before they can even do anything. That would be an opportunity to run in the other direction, because all of our services for foreclosure prevention are always provided at no cost. The city, helps to fund to make that possible so that these services can always be provided for free of charge to the homeowner.
Yeah, and thank you for bringing that up, because we are seeing an increase in sort of the fraudulent behavior happening. So I think especially because people are especially vulnerable at this time, where they're looking for any possible hope and help, right? And it is overwhelming that they're more susceptible sometimes to when people come to them and say, oh, I can help fix your problem and make it all go away, but you have to pay me something ahead of time. And so we just really want to caution people against those things, and really reaching out to some of our nonprofit partners like Homeownership SF and others, so that we can make sure that you are connected to kind of credible information. So again, I think this idea about credible information and help is really important, especially at this time. So if you or somebody that you know are in need of this kind of assistance, please make sure they kind of hear this message and that you share this resource with them. So Shannon, just kind of jumping right into it, I think probably a lot of people are curious to know whether there are any financial assistance programs that are currently available for families, for homeowners, or for tenants. Can you tell us a little bit about what you know is out there?
Absolutely. Well, the most common solution that we are seeing at this time, which is quickly and readily available to the majority of homeowners, is forbearance. Now, forbearance is a very general term. It can mean a lot of different things, and there can be very different terms depending upon the servicer or the investor that is behind the loan. And so, basically what a forbearance is it's a temporary suspension of mortgage payments that is agreed by the servicer to allow somebody to recover from financial hardship. The reality is that loan servicers are in the business of servicing loans, not necessarily wanting to do foreclosures. Obviously foreclosure is a last resort for many of them, and so oftentimes we do find that those servicers will very easily agree to a forbearance, particularly when you can document the financial hardship. And what that means is that you have to pay the amount, but at a later date. So it would allow you to skip payments for 3 months or 6 months up to a year. During which time interest will continue to accrue, but no monthly payments will be due. And typically the late fees are waived. You will see some situations where, late fees are included in there, but for the most part, the servicer's part of that is agreeing to waive the late fees. Now, when it comes to repayment, that's really where you're going to see the biggest difference in terms of the terms of different forbearances, person to person and bank to bank. And so it could be that there is a lump sum, otherwise known as a balloon payment, that would be due at the end of the loan. So you pay for 30 years and then there'll be, this amount that had been set aside that needs to be paid at once. Sometimes you'll see where however many payments that were missed will just kind of be tacked on to the end of the loan. So you would just continue to pay beyond that end of that 30-year term to pay the loan in full. What we are seeing more commonly is a repayment plan over agreed upon period. So perhaps the institution will say, for 6 months, we will agree to this forbearance. At the end of 6 months, you can either pay a lump sum that's due at the end of the forbearance period, or more commonly, we'll give you 12 months where we're going to slightly increase the payment that you are making once you're making mortgage payments again, to be able to, pay that off over 12 months, what you didn't pay for that 6-month period. So if you've been offered a forbearance, it's really, it can be a challenge to get those terms documented, but it is really important to ask to make sure that you are clear on what the conditions of that forbearance are. And again, this is something that, we have been seeing where the counselors are really kind of having to make that extra effort and push to help make sure that we get something in writing, not just a verbal, yes, we'll do the forbearance, without the proper documentation and clarification of those terms.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's incredibly important to kind of just, it's not just kind of on the phone, yes, this is what's going to happen, but also to kind of know what's going to happen at the end of a forbearance period. I think, especially right now, I think it's incredibly hard for folks, because if they don't have the ability to make the ends meet right now, it's tough to imagine, if things don't change, that they're going to be able to do that in, a few months' time. Can you tell us about any kind of loan programs that might be available to folks?
Absolutely. So, the forbearance is typically, as I said, the first step, and it's pretty much insured for most federally backed mortgages. What a federally backed mortgage means is that the mortgage has been insured or is completely owned by a federal agency. And so if your loan is insured by Fannie Mae or Freddie Mac, if you have an FHA loan or a VA loan, there's an automatic forbearance that is required of the servicer before they proceed to a foreclosure process, and so that really is the first step. For people for whom this does not apply, for people whom this does not solve the problem, as you say, it continues to go on, there is also city money that is available as well. And so, we have the help loan, which has been in place for several years now, to provide up to $50,000 for homeowners who have become delinquent or need that additional financial support from the city in order to get through, and retain their housing and keep their home. And so in response to the COVID emergency, the city has actually laxed some of the requirements around that and created a special loan for people who may be experiencing financial hardship due to the COVID-19 pandemic. And so this help loan is available online. You can go to the Mayor's Office of Housing to apply for it. A housing counselor can also help you apply for it. And that can be an amount of money between $12,000 and $25,000, again, to help with either current or future HOA dues, back mortgage payments, and also that can be applied to special assessments if that is something that somebody has a condo that has a special assessment situation. Primarily, we are seeing most of the help loan applications at this time really focusing on the mortgage, needing assistance with the mortgage. But of course, in order to prioritize this money for the people who need it the most, the city is going to want to see that, if you have a mortgage forbearance possible and available to you, that you've utilized that resource as well, prior to reaching out for the actual funding.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Shannon. So I think the next question is for me, so I'm going to take that one. This one is a question that came in from some of the participants who have asked about just generally property taxes. And so we understand that in addition to, typically for many people, especially if you still are servicing a loan, your mortgage payments typically are a large expense in terms of maintaining your home. But on top of that, there's also property taxes that is a portion of what you would be paying. And so if the question here is, will this year's property taxes be delayed or reduced? And are there tax savings for seniors? And so a few things, I think one thing that's important for people to know is that in San Francisco, we actually have to follow the same rules that every single other county, all 58 counties in the state of California, follows when it comes to property taxes. And so it is a county function that is basically governed by state law and the state constitution. I think probably many people know part of the property tax laws are actually governed by a ballot initiative called Proposition 13 as well. And so some of these things are not changeable even by the state legislature, but there are some elements that could potentially be changed by the state. But I think that is just to say that we've had a lot of questions from people about whether we can, in San Francisco, we can just simply not collect property taxes or do something different. Unfortunately, we actually are governed and tied to state law. And so if the entire state is doing something, we can do it, but we cannot have a different outcome in San Francisco that way. There are a few things that is important for people to know. There is a senior, through the controller, the state controller, there is something called a tax postponement program for seniors. And this is for seniors and individuals who are disabled. The interest rate is, I think, something like 6% or so. There's more information specifically on the state controller's website, but essentially what that means is that if you qualify for the program, so you meet a certain income threshold for a senior, you could potentially have your property taxes postponed. Essentially, you're not paying them, and you would kind of pay them back with interest when you sell them, or when you sell that property, or or if the time comes that you pass away and your home is basically transferred to a new owner. Again, there is an interest rate associated with it. It is not probably the right program for everybody, but it is one program that exists at the state level, and I want to make sure people are aware of that. We're going to share the link to that controller program with you, but again, this is for seniors, and there is an income threshold in terms of people who qualify. So I do want to go then to our slide, if Holly can put up a slide for us that kind of shows the considerations for how it is that we want to think about whether or not COVID-19 impacts property taxes. And so the first thing that I want to make sure that you understand is just kind of the timeline for how property taxes are created. So you're going to see that there on the very, very left of the slide, you see that January 1 is actually an important date every year for us in the assessor's office. It is actually the one day that we're supposed to be taking a look at people's property values and essentially deciding what your values are as of that point in time. The reason that's important is because we take a look at the value of your property at that time and compare it to your Prop 13 protected value. Whichever value is lower is what we are using in terms of the value to calculate your property taxes for that upcoming tax year. Why we show you this property tax timeline is because from that January 1 date to when you actually receive a bill and make the payment, there's actually quite a lag. And so although we're taking a look as of January 1 every year for what that comparison or market value comparison is, you won't actually receive your bill for that payment until October of that year. So for January 1, you'll receive your property tax bills in October, and they don't become due until December 2020 in this case, and April 2021. So again, there's a full year plus lag in terms of when you make that property tax payment for that January 1 lien date. Under a COVID-19 scenario, it is probably unlikely in general that we're going to see a big market impact to January 1, 2020. And why is that? Because as everybody can recall, in San Francisco, we did not have a state of an emergency declared until February, so past that lien date, and shelter in place didn't happen until March, so much later than that first January 1 lien date. So most likely the shelter in place and COVID-19 didn't really impact market values as of January 1, 2020, which is used to calculate your upcoming tax bill. However, I think that we do know that there is a big impact in terms of market and what we can see going forward. And so if we continue to see ourselves in a shelter-in-place scenario for a very long time, if we continue to see pretty significant drops in terms of business activity, the economy, as well as market values of property going into January 2021, then what we would expect to see is that it probably could have an impact on your value at that point in time, and then we would see an impact in that out year. So again, in terms of property taxes for this upcoming year, we don't think there's going to be a huge impact related specifically to COVID-19, but the out year, we might actually see that impact. There's another slide that we want to make sure to share with you. And this is something that is important to also understand in terms of Prop 13. And so remember when I had mentioned that we take a look as of January 1 about what kind of your market value is, and we compare it to your Prop 13 value. Well, people often ask us, well, what is my Prop 13 value? And so this chart really helps you to understand that a bit. And so if you take a look at that lower line on this graph, and it's a solid line, this is something that kind of illustrates what a Prop 13 value would be. So in this scenario, what happened is, let's just say that you purchased your property in 2019, you bought that home for $700,000. Under Prop 13, the way that we would have to tax you is that we would essentially have that value, $700,000, so long as it was a market value at the time that you bought it. We would increase your assessment value, basically your taxable value, by no more than 2%, or the California CPI, whichever is lower. For the most part, we've seen that the CPI that we've applied has been roughly 2%. So again, it's a cap on how it is that we can increase it. It's rarely fallen below 2%. So for the most part, 2% is really the inflation factor that happens. So as you can see, in 2019, it was at 700,000. In 2020, we would generally be taxing at 700,000 plus 2% increase, and every year thereafter. Now, take a look at that line, the dotted line above. This might reflect and actually this number here in terms of in my example, that 100 or that $1 million actually should be kind of connected to that 700,000 there. But the way that works is that we would say, what is your market value as of each particular year? So let's just say we take a look at 2020 as an example. In 2020, your Prop 13 value is a little bit over 700,000. Perhaps at that time, the market value of your home, if you were to try to sell it or you were to try to buy a like property, was $1.1 million. In a situation like that, we would basically take that 700,000 roughly, a little bit above $700,000 value, and we would use that number to tax because it is the lower of your market value or your Prop 13 value, right? And so if we kind of go forward to your 2021 value, I think this is an example where, let's just say in 2021, we see a drop or a reduction in the market value of your home. In this case, you still wouldn't see a property tax reduction because take a look, your Prop 13 value is still lower than that reduced market value. And so I think this is why we just want to be illustrating how we would take a look at it according to the law, because again, we're taking a look at every January 1 of what your property taxes, what your Prop 13 value is compared to the market value, and whichever is lower, we're going to be using for your taxation purposes. So again, not only are we going to be taking a look at the market conditions in terms of whether market values are dropping, but we're also going to say vis-a-vis your Prop 13 value, is it higher or lower? And if the market value is lower, that will impact your property taxes. So hopefully this is something that's helpful for people to understand generally how property taxes work and how it is that it is tied to state law as a whole. In the next slide, we do want to share with you that we do have additional property tax programs that can help people. And so for people who are living in your home right now, if you are a homeowner and you live in the property, you qualify for something called a homeowner's exemption. We send out a notice of assessed value to you every single year in the month of July. You should have received it already. And on that list or on that sheet, you're actually going to see a line that points to homeowner's exemption. If you live in your home and you don't see a deduction or a credit essentially for that homeowner's deduction, please contact our office and fill out a form, and then we'll make sure that we can apply that so that you do have savings. It's a $7,000 reduction to your assessed value, so it translates to roughly about $70 to $80 in terms of tax savings annually. It's not a lot, but it is better than nothing at all, so we want to make sure that you have that. A lot of people ask why that number is so low. That value, the $7,000 reduction number, was actually passed at the state level in 1978. And the state legislature hasn't changed that, and it hasn't gone up with CPI since that time. So that is the reason that number is so low. It used to be a much more meaningful number back in 1978, but it's much different now in 2020. The other program that we want people to know about is that you also have special assessments on top of your regular property taxes, and these are because of voter approved ballot measures. And so it could be, for example, a San Francisco Unified School District parcel tax or City College parcel tax. With the school district, there is a program that is available for seniors where you can be exempted from paying that parcel tax if you live in the property or if you own that property. So it depends on which ballot measure it is. It has different conditions, but we definitely encourage seniors to reach out to the San Francisco Unified School District to make sure that you apply for it if you are eligible. That can actually save you something like $200 to $300 annually, if not more. And so that is a meaningful amount for, I think, many individuals. And so I think that is it in terms of property taxes, how it would work in terms of a COVID-19 scenario and savings that are available. So in terms of the next question, I think it's going to be about individuals who are over 54. And so people have asked, if I'm over 54 and I want to keep my tax basis, but would like to consider moving out of San Francisco, what should I do? What are the criteria? And so sorry, Shannon, this is also a property tax question for me, so I'm gonna just share quickly. So again, this is a question about, can I transfer my protected Prop 13 base value to another county? So we do want people to know that there are two programs that are available. The first is an inter-county program, so basically people who live in San Francisco. It's called Prop 60. And the way that that would work is essentially if you own a property in San Francisco right now and you meet the age criteria, so you are 55 years old or above, and you decide that you want to switch out your property to another one within San Francisco, you actually can potentially keep that Prop 13, low Prop 13 assessed value and take it with you to the new property. There are a couple of conditions that are required. So again, I mentioned the eligibility. You have to be 55 years and older. It has to be a property within San Francisco, the replacement property. The new home and the old home must have been your principal residence, so the home that you lived in, and then of course the replacement property also being the home that you will live in. There is a requirement that the new home has to be purchased or has to be built within 2 years of the sale of the old home. So there's a 2-year period of time in which you can activate this benefit. And then and then finally, the market price of the new home has to be lower or the same value as the market value of the home that you're basically replacing. So there is sort of some criteria associated with it that you would need to know about. There is another program. Can we go into the next slide? That is available for individuals. And so that program is called Proposition 90. And this is something where, as the question had asked, if I moved out of San Francisco, do I have the same benefit program available? Under Prop 90, if you are moving to a county that is actually okay with receiving that property tax base year value, that Prop 13 value, then you're able to transfer that value from San Francisco to another county. Not every single county is a recipient of Prop 13 base year values. There are, I want to say, maybe 13 or so counties that do take that Prop 13 value from other counties to their county. And so we definitely want to encourage you to go to the State California Board of Equalization website to take a look at which counties are participating. Alternatively, if you know, for example, that you're going to move to a different county, whether it's Riverside or a different one, you can actually just call that county assessor and ask whether they receive Prop 13 base year value transfers from other jurisdictions. So again, the same program conditions apply, but again, it would just be a requirement that the receiving county has that program available. Okay, so I think Holly has just pulled up some of the counties that are participating. So you can see Alameda, Los Angeles, Orange County, Riverside, San Bernardino. These are sort of the different counties that do receive Prop 13 base year transfers from other jurisdictions. So again, this is on the website. We'll put a link up so that people have that as well. All right. And I think that is it for me. I'm going to turn over to Shannon with the next question, which is cash out refinance appropriate during the pandemic time? And how best should I receive a good interest loan? Shannon, I think you're on mute.
Thank you. In answer to the first question, it depends. Every situation is unique. It really depends upon how much time you have left working, what your ability to repay would be. You need to remember that, in taking cash out of your home, you will have to pay that back, and you'll have a new loan that will incorporate, that higher principal balance. That said, certainly this is a tool that, many people are using, and that, can really help you to access your home equity, to be able to get by financially through, financially trying times. That's one of the wonderful things about home ownership, is the ability to leverage that equity and be able to pull it out when you need it. One thing I will say is that a cash out refinance will typically typically have a higher level of scrutiny from a lender perspective than doing what they might call a rate and term refinance. So a rate and term refinance would be where you do not pull money out, but potentially could get a lower payment by refinancing, either because you now have a better loan to value ratio or because, you have a better interest rate. So, if you've purchased your home and you have a 5% interest rate right now, certainly there can be, opportunity to, potentially get a lower rate and qualify for even a little bit of cash out at a payment that is equal to or lower to what you're currently paying. And so in that situation, it could be a very appropriate way to be able to recapture that equity and utilize it to help you out financially. In terms of how do you get the best interest rate, the first thing is to have good credit. Credit is a huge factor. It's the number one factor that lenders are using really when they are determining what your interest rate is going to be. And so one of the things that we can do with the housing counselors can actually pull your credit for you before you apply, so that we can go ahead and review what is the information that is on the credit report. You would be surprised how many people have errors, things that are not reported accurately and that can be easily removed to give you that bump in your credit report that is necessary. In addition, there may be things that can be done with the housing counselor, can advise on how to increase your score. And then that way, when you go and shop with the lenders, and talk to different lenders, you're going to get the benefit of that higher credit score.
Yeah, absolutely.
The other thing that I would say is that it's really important to talk to a bunch of different lenders. This is not a case of what, people often say, well, who's a good lender? I want to talk to a good bank. This isn't really as much about good and bad banks, but which banks have the programs and services which are targeted to a situation that is most like yours. And so there are banks that are going to be, far more lenient for things like self-employment, or even, for slightly lower credit scores, whereas other banks might, have different requirements around that. You'll actually see a surprising disparity. The other thing I think that's really of value in talking to multiple lenders, and we always recommend at least 3, the reason is because that first lender you talk to, you're kind of just understanding what's going on. The market changes all the time, loan requirements change all the time. So you're kind of just getting a basis of, what's going on, but it's really hard to contextualize that and to kind of understand until you have something to compare it to. So then when you talk to that second lender, now you're comparing that second lender to the first one. And so in your mind, you can't help but sort of rank them, as good or bad according to this information that you've already received. And the magic happens really when you have that third lender that you've talked to, because now you can know that you're really getting a representative perspective, on a variety of options, and having the information and the learning curve that you've gone through to get to that point really will empower you to be able to be more solid in your decision and really understand some of the differences between the requirements that different lenders will have.
Thank you. I see that Annie has jumped on because I think she's about to tell me that we have to go to Q&A, but I do want to actually adjust one more question to Shannon that we received ahead of time because I think this is relevant, and that is, there are people who have talked about having HELOC payments, or basically home equity line of credits that they've taken out, and they currently now have sort of a monthly mortgage. Some people have now lost their jobs where they're unable to potentially make that same payment, and so people want to just understand, if there's opportunities to refinance to a fixed rate loan and take advantage of sort of lower interest rates at this moment. And then I think the other question related to that is also, there's also been conversations that some people have around, should they take out an equity loan if they didn't already have one, and or should they kind of take into account like a reverse mortgage loan, like those kinds of things? Like what should people know about the different products and options that are out there for folks on refinancing?
Well, certainly there are a lot of lenders who are very eager to refinance due to the lower interest rates that we have been seeing, in recent history as compared to even, 5 or 6 years ago when interest rates were significantly higher. There will be costs associated with a refinance. You're going to have a couple of $1,000s of closing costs. Sometimes those can be rolled into the loan so that you don't have to pay them up front, but they're added to the principal balance. And again, with the refinancing, certainly shop around, talk to a wide variety, at least 3 different banking institutions that you can get a good perspective on what good even means, because it is going to be dependent upon your situation. One thing that I will say, though, that we do sometimes see where people get in trouble with reverse mortgages, and that is because they look at reverse mortgages as sort of an alternative to a home equity loan, where maybe what they might need is the ability to take, to refinance and take some cash out, or the ability to take an equity loan and access that equity. But then maybe because they don't have the income to qualify, or for other reasons, they'll determine instead to get a reverse mortgage. A reverse mortgage is a very different loan product than a home equity loan. And so, if you are in that situation where you're, considering refinancing, and particularly if you're considering taking out a reverse mortgage, really, we want to encourage you to set up that free counseling appointment, come in and sit down and discuss that option with a housing counselor, so that they can really make sure that you understand, what the loan product itself is going to require of you, what happens at the end of that term, and really to determine what is going to be the best product. There may be things that you can do to help, adjust some of the problems that might prevent somebody from being able to refinance or take out an equity line of credit that could prevent them from having to get a reverse mortgage. And so we really want to make sure you explore those options before, taking a loan, and signing the paperwork on a new loan that will significantly change what happens to the property at the end of the term.
Absolutely. So I'm going to turn it over to Annie for a lightning round of questions. Let's see how many we can get through.
Thank you so much, Assessor Shu and Shannon. There were so many questions coming in, and we only have 5 minutes for Q&A, so I really apologize in advance, but we will get to you individually afterwards and answer your questions as best as we can. So we do have a question here. I'm a 70-year-old and live in San Francisco. If I buy a home and use Prop 60 or Prop 90 to use my Prop 13 value, what will happen with property taxes if I continue to also own it as a rental property or transfer it to myself?
So that's a big question. So very quickly, if you have a current property in San Francisco and you meet all the eligibilities for Prop 60 for within our county, we would likely transfer the Prop 13 value to you. So you basically would benefit from a continued lower Prop 13 value. But if you're planning to use that property now as a rental property, then you're no longer eligible. So remember that it has to be the home that you're living in, and also the replacement home also has to be your primary residence as well. So just know that there are eligibility requirements in order to benefit from that transfer.
Great. Here's another question. Do I need to pay transfer tax if I add my sister to my house title or removing her from the title? Thank you.
So this is a great question. I'm going to ask Adrienne Yan from my office to join in and answer that specific question. So Adrienne?
Hi there. Can you repeat the question again?
Yes. Do I need to pay transfer tax if I add my sister to my house title or removing her from the title?
So transfer tax, it depends. There are, I think all transfers, you have to pay transfer tax, but you have to look on our website. If it was a gift, it's you'd be exempt from paying transfer tax. If you're talking about accessibility, we would have to look at the ownership and how you're adding your sister to title. In general, all transfers are change in ownership, which is accessible, but we would have to look at the specific situations.
So let me kind of color that a little bit more. So a few things. Adrienne is with our transactions division, so she really talks to more kind of the whether or not a transaction is considered reassessable to market value. So a few things happening here. When people kind of add names to titles, basically onto a deed, it's essentially kind of adding a new owner to a property, right? And so I think that's something that people need to be thinking about. There are certain conditions in which transfer taxes would not apply, and so I would encourage you. I'm going to ask our folks to put a link onto the transfer tax website on our the link to our transfer tax website, because you can see specifically what are some of those instances in which transfer tax would not apply to you. But you do have to fill out an affidavit, basically affirming and promising that you're telling the truth, that that's the way the transaction is happening. So that's something that's important for people to know. Oftentimes what people will do is that they're going to put names on titles in order to qualify for refinancings, right? And so we get that question a lot in terms of whether or not when I put a name on for refinancing, does that kind of trigger a reassessment? And so we do, we actually will take a look to say, after a period of time, was that name removed from title, or has it stayed on? And those are some of the things that we would be considering and taking a look at to see whether a true ownership change has happened, or if it was simply for a refinancing purpose. So there is a difference, and we recognize that, but we would definitely encourage, if you have specific questions about your transaction, to let us know. But again, just remember, if you're putting names on titles, the way that we're seeing it is because without knowing anything else about kind of the transition, it looks like there's a new owner on a property, right? And so just remember that may trigger a reassessment, and so you really want to take a look at the laws closely.
Great, thank you so much, Assessor Chu. So we are just about running out of time. So at this point, we'd like to ask for you and Shannon to have any closing remarks to share with our viewers.
Oh, I'm so sorry. I wish we could have done more lightning round questions, but we will promise to kind of get back to all of the questions that we see on the chat and try to get you links as much as we can. So I just want to thank Shannon very much for all of your help all throughout the years in terms of joining us on our Family Wealth Forum and providing good information, not only with us, but with the community. We know that we depend on you a lot. Whenever we see notices of foreclosures happen, we send that information to you so that you can reach out proactively to folks. So we really appreciate you, your organization, and all that you're doing to try to help San Franciscans.
I'm also sad that we don't have more time for Q&A. I could do Q&A all day. I love that engagement, and I love hearing people's questions. But I would just say, you know, I see my contact information is up here. You know, definitely reach out. You know, we're happy to talk further offline and really have that opportunity to dive a little deeper into the individual situations that people are dealing with, and really just develop a plan that's right for you, for wherever you're at and whatever is going on. And I just, again, thank you to I almost promoted you or demoted you. I'm not sure which, but thank you to Assessor Chu for putting this all together, and her fantastic team who've worked so hard at this. You know, it's, again, really important to get the word out there and to really help people to engage with these difficulties that are happening for you right now, because that's really the only way to work it. You know, sitting and being scared and doing nothing and feeling alone, that's no way to live. You know, I personally have been through that situation myself, and, you know, reach out, get the help you need. I just want to encourage people to utilize the resources that are available. There's a lot more than I think people realize that is available in terms of resources within the city, and through our nonprofit community of housing service providers. And, you know, and we're happy to help connect people, not only to our members, but also to the broader coalition of partners that we work with.
Yeah, and I think that's a fantastic way to kind of close this, which is to say, no matter where you are in your financial situation, please don't feel embarrassed by where you are. Please don't ever feel ashamed in terms of and feeling like you're alone and that there's no help out there. There is. So I just want to make sure people know that, and it is a really difficult time that people are in right now. So don't feel embarrassed. Don't feel ashamed to reach out for help, because that's why organizations like homeownership exist, SF exists to help and to make sure we help you get on your feet. So thank you again, Shannon.
Well, thank you so much again, Assessor Chu and Executive Director Shannon Wei, for such a resourceful and informative sessions. At this point, we're going to take a 5-minute break before we start our last session. During this time, again, I want to remind folks to take a look at the poll at the bottom of your screen. You can fill out the poll anonymously, and we encourage you to give us feedback in terms of our sessions today. We will resume in a couple of minutes, so thank you again, and we'll see you again soon. Give us a couple of minutes. Hello, everyone. If you're just joining us, welcome to our first Digital Family Wealth Forum. Before we begin our last session of the day, I would like to let you know the webinar is being recorded and shared today on YouTube Live, as well as SFGov TV. As you may know, the Family Wealth Forum is an annual financial education event put forward by our elected assessor in 2017. We were able to help over 1,300 families so far, and so we are very honored to continue to support you and your families during this time. Before I invite our leader, Assessor Chu, to start our last session, I'd like to go over a few housekeeping tips with you again. We are committed to serving all populations, so we are offering Spanish and Chinese interpretation today. If you prefer to listen to those languages, please go ahead and select the language channel at the bottom of your screen. Click on the Earth icon and select Cantonese or Spanish. There's also a Q&A function that is located at the bottom of your screen. At any point you have any questions, please go ahead and type it in, and we will try to respond as much as we can during the webinar. And if we do run out of time, we will reach out to you afterwards. I will now ask Vivian Poe to explain in language so that our participants can get settled in their channels. Vivian? Thank you so much. Mario, could you please explain in language so that all our participants can settle in the channels? Thank you so much, Mario and Vivian. May I now ask our bold leader, Assessor Carmen Chu, to join us in introducing Kendra Bowen as we get started with our third session, Estate Planning and Ownership Transfers.
Thank you very much, Annie. I like how every time we enter into a new session, Annie has a new description for me. So I appreciate her trying to liven up the transitions. But I am really, really excited that everyone is either joining us now for this new session or have continued with us through our Family Wealth Forum Digital this morning. I think as I mentioned earlier, especially with COVID-19, we know how important it is to make sure that we're providing as much credible financial information as possible. We talked earlier today about some personal finance tips and information. We shared a little bit at the last session about resources that are available to homeowners and to families. And right now, we're really, really excited to kick off our last part of our session, which is around estate planning and just planning for the future. So I want to introduce our guests, but before I do, I just want to say again how important this is, especially now. You know, I think it's often hard to kind of think about kind of planning for the future in a situation where we won't be there, right? And so when we pass away or when our loved ones pass away, it's not an easy topic to talk about, but I really do believe that doing so, it really puts all of us kind of at peace of mind, but it also is protection for our loved ones. It helps to make sure that during the time when they're going through grieving and through a very difficult time, that your wishes, they understand well, and that there are no, you can kind of prevent a lot of like the arguments that might happen about what people think you wanted, when you pass away, etc. So I know it's an uncomfortable conversation sometimes, but it really is one of the ultimate acts of love to be able to plan and help put at ease kind of what your family will have to go through, or your loved ones will have to go through afterwards. So I do hope people will learn a lot from Kendra today. In particular, because we are in the middle of an active global health pandemic, and health becomes an even more and more important topic than ever. And so Kendra is actually joining us from, she is a staff attorney, and she's joining us from the Housing and Economic Rights Advocates. We call it short HERA. HERA has actually been our inaugural organization who has been with us from the very beginning when we started our Family Wealth Forum, and he has been a great contributor and have provided great information every single time. But before we begin to get directly to the questions, I want to read a quick bio about Kendra so that you know who we're joined with in this program. So as a San Mateo County native, we'll forgive you for not San Francisco, but you're pretty close. Kendra obtained great satisfaction, or she has real great satisfaction helping to use the law to assist Bay Area residents and homeowners to avoid time-consuming, costly, and disruptive probate processes. She graduated from Hastings College of the Law, yay, and UC Davis, and guides fellow residents through the estate planning process in a fun and efficient way. Her creative and positive approach ensures that each client makes the right decision given their estate and family situation. While performing thousands of estate plans, Kendra has successfully worked through nearly every possible family and estate situation, including her own journey with now 2 deceased parents. Most clients comment that the estate planning process is much less of a chore than they thought, and they're very happy when they've had a chance to work with Kendra to get their affairs in order. And I can definitely attest to that. Kendra has got a great energy about her, and so I'm excited to have you on. Welcome, Kendra. So, Kendra, our first question while you unmute is, people want to know, well, hello, but also, what does estate planning involve? Can you tell us, just give us a broad overview of what that looks like?
Absolutely, Carmen, and thank you so much for that very warm welcome. So estate planning involves a host of topics and issues that many of us face, or at least our families will face. Like Carmen, or like Assessor Chu indicated, it involves what we want to happen one day when we pass away, or when ourselves and our spouse pass away. But equally important is what happens when we are alive, but let's say either permanently or temporarily incapacitated.
Yeah.
At ERA, frankly, that's what prompted us to begin an estate planning department where fees are on a sliding scale, because we were helping to save people's homes. But if they were to become incapacitated, we didn't have anyone in place to take over handling their issues, to deal with an assessor's entity, to deal with the IRS, anything like that. So it's essentially two different topics, scenarios, and legal documents that will take care of all of this. So maybe I'll break it down into those two larger topics, and it will prompt some thinking about this. We'll begin with a scenario, a reality of life. Let's say you or you and your spouse were in an accident, and both of you are in the hospital for 5-6 weeks. A lot of things go awry. If you're a renter, your rent may go unpaid. If you were just about to file your taxes, didn't get back to the accountant to sign your final tax return, that would be undone. Let's say you just needed someone to simply pay your bills, but yet you and your spouse were in the hospital. With certain legal documents, you can easily put someone in place to handle those tasks, so that when you hopefully recover and get better and get back to your normal life, things are as they should be. Your rent will be paid, your mortgage would be paid, you wouldn't be facing adverse financial issues. On the flip side of that, let's say once again, you and your spouse or you yourself were in a hospital, and you were not able to communicate yourself to convey what you want for yourself, and perhaps what you don't want for yourself. If you were in very dire medical situation, you need someone there to advocate for you with those medical professionals, to make sure that your wishes are implemented, rather than someone else imposing their wishes upon what you think is right or not right for yourself and your body. So through certain legal documents, we can, while we're feeling good and don't need it, indicate someone to take over should that situation take place, so that our desires are communicated to medical professionals and we are in control of what happens to us.
Yeah,
okay, so
absolutely.
That's the part of estate planning. That's when we're alive, but let's say we're incapacitated and not able to handle either financial issues or medical issues for ourselves. And that's a very important part. A lot of people only think of estate planning as involving what happens when we pass away and what happens to our assets or our stuff when we pass away. So the second part of estate planning is, as Assessor Chu indicated, when we pass away, what do we want to have happen to our stuff? Where do we want our estate to go? And what do we want that process to look like? Once again, when we're feeling good and everything is going well, that's when we need to plan through either beneficiary designations, transfer on death deeds, putting a will or a trust together, and we'll discuss those differences shortly. Through those tools, we're able to make sure that our assets pass with the least amount of chaos, expense, while maintaining harmony within our families, to make sure that that does take place. So there are certain legal documents that handle that situation.
Absolutely. And so I think just to reemphasize for folks, as Kendra was mentioning, estate planning is much more than just kind of saying, what do I want to have happen to the things that I own after I pass away? It's also about how it is that you want your affairs to be taken care of, whether it's financial or health, if you should become incapacitated. So if you're not able to communicate, if people get into an accident, if you're unconscious, those kinds of things that do happen in life. How is it that you're going to have your bills continue to get paid? How is it that you're going to be able to have some medical decisions be made for you, especially if you're not able to make those decisions yourself? So just remember that it's much more broad than just what do you want to have happen if you should pass, but it's also what can I be doing to prepare now for a situation where I can't speak for myself or I can't make those decisions on my own. So I really appreciate I really appreciate you bringing that up, because that is especially important right now when we're in the middle of a health pandemic. So maybe we can jump right into, Kendra, a point that you were making earlier about what the difference is between a trust or a will, because I think people kind of say, well, okay, like let's kind of talk about kind of the leaving the assets part for just a moment. And you know, people
Absolutely.
typically have done it trust will, and people say, well, what's the difference? Which one should I do? Can you tell us more about the differences?
Absolutely. Yes. So both legal documents distribute property at death. A will is appropriate for people if the gross value of their estate is under $150,000. Okay. If your assets are over $150,000 and you cannot put beneficiaries on those assets, even if you had a will distributing those assets, unfortunately, there would be a probate process here in California, which is expensive. It is public. Your executor needs to publish things in the paper. And it's often unnecessary if you take other active steps to avoid that probate process that we have. So both documents distribute property at death. With certain kinds of assets, like I just mentioned, you can put beneficiaries on assets. So for instance, retirement accounts, life insurance, certain types of other financial accounts, you can merely put a beneficiary or two beneficiaries on that asset. And when you pass away, a death certificate would be presented, and that asset would be distributed to the living people indicated as beneficiary designations. In the same regard, on a transfer on death deed, if you put beneficiaries down, once a death certificate is presented, that property could be distributed and avoid the awful probate process that we have here. If people have businesses that are worth a lot of money, sometimes a business succession plan can handle some of that, but often if that business is worth over $150,000, a trust would be warranted. And then if someone is not going to take the active step of preparing a transfer on death deed and is not satisfied with the limited options available there, then if you own a piece of property in California, you certainly own an asset worth over $150,000, a trust would be in order. Please keep in mind also, by gross value, the probate court does not care about any liens or encumbrances or mortgages against the property. So once again, if you own a piece of real property in California, you own something worth over $150,000. So a trust may be warranted in that case.
Kendra, can I just clarify on that one for just a moment? So you said that the threshold for when something would go to probate is $150,000, but does that number then exclude situations where a beneficiary designation is possible? So let's just say, for example, I have savings account worth $10,000, but I do have a home that is now worth $1 million, right? And so if on the home, I was able to file for something called a transfer on death deed that can actually avoid probate, then would the $150,000 really just apply to that $10,000 that remains, or is it cumulative?
That is correct, Assessor Chu. It would only apply to the assets on which you have not placed a beneficiary. So it may not, if you did take the active step of placing a beneficiary on that account, there wouldn't even need to be a mini probate that would take place. It's really just assets. It could be expensive cars, or when someone has not taken the step to do a transfer on death deed.
Got it.
Or if another instance when that takes place is if people have put one beneficiary on an asset, let's say a significant retirement account or a life insurance policy, but that beneficiary has predeceased them, is no longer living. So then there is a probate. So it's a good time while everyone's thinking about this to revisit your beneficiary designations on some of your assets, retirement, life insurance, any accounts on which you placed a beneficiary, and hopefully some of you will do so now, to make sure that that still makes sense for you in your life, and make sure please that you have a contingent beneficiary, a second choice down.
Got it. So just for recap, if I'm hearing it correctly, what I'm understanding is that there are certain ways in which people are able to pass on their asset without having to go to probate. One is through a trust. You can create a trust to do so, and that would be able to avoid going through probate. A second is if the law allows for certain kind of financial asset accounts to designate beneficiaries officially kind of through the institution. In those instances, sort of like, as you mentioned, retirement accounts, like a savings or checkings account, some of those types of things, those are able to also bypass probate so long as you've designated the beneficiary with the institutions, essentially. But what you're saying is that if there are anything that are outside of those kind of state allowed kind of ways to bypass probate in terms of beneficiary information, if your assets exceed 150,000, you will have to go through probate, which is a court process. It's lengthy. Most times people have to hire an attorney to kind of go through it, and wills don't necessarily won't absolve you of having to go through probate if you have more than 150,000 essentially. Is that right?
That is correct, yes. With respect to beneficiaries, as long as a beneficiary indicated on an account is still alive and can be the recipient of that asset, that is true. And a will has to go through the probate process if it's going to distribute $150,000 or more in assets, so that is true.
Got it. Kendra, can you speak a little bit about the difference between, if people have heard the terms revocable, irrevocable trusts?
Absolutely. So 99.5% of the trusts that we do are revocable trusts. So essentially the trust is you. We create this structure. It's the trust. It could be the Jones Family Trust. After that's created, we're going to help you put your assets into it. So it's typically an account and a home, a piece of real property. You are free to change that trust at any time, because there's language in there that allows you, or in the case of a married couple, you and your spouse, to change beneficiaries, to change trustees. You can always add things to the trust. It's frankly meant to grow with the family as they go through life, so that you will put new assets into the trust. So that is a revocable trust. You have control of everything. You're accountable to no one. You could sell it, spend it, move to Tahiti, do whatever you want with the assets in that trust. Once in a while, we do an irrevocable trust. An irrevocable trust, you cannot change. You essentially do not own the assets in an irrevocable trust once you sign assets over to that trust. So it's typically used if we're trying to remove assets from someone's taxable estate. Estate tax threshold nowadays is $11 million, and this doesn't come up frequently, but sometimes people do want to take things out of their taxable estate, and so we do create an irrevocable trust. But most of the time, you want to have control of your assets, and you want to be able to change the beneficiaries or successor trustees. So most of the time, you would have a revocable trust, and that's why when you put property, real property, into that revocable trust, there is no reassessment, because the county views you as still completely owning those assets. You are the primary trustee, trustor. You still own that asset. It's just a different way to hold title.
Yeah, absolutely. And so I think that gets to one of the questions that we get often, you know, especially in a revocable trust. What we typically will be looking at in terms of the assessor's office is that we take a look at, you know, who owned the property prior to something going into a trust. And then we take a look at who are the beneficial owners after it goes into a revocable trust. And if it's exactly the same, there is no essentially kind of change in ownership essentially in that situation. So I think it is important for people to kind of recognize that we are understanding that there are differences in how people are holding it, but so long as the ownership hasn't changed, it doesn't trigger a reassessment per property tax laws.
Right.
So just a few things to think about there.
Absolutely, absolutely. And sometimes people are hesitant. They feel like they're giving up control by deeding over their property to their trust, to their family trust, but it is still theirs. They are the only people who can change beneficiary designations. Once again, they can sell it, and the money is completely theirs. They are accountable to no one other than themselves.
Yeah, absolutely. So the next question we have is a question that where someone had written in that said, how much estate planning can I do on my own? Are there online trust documents that are valid in the state of California? So I'm going to answer a part of that, and then I hope Kendra can also add to this a bit. But I think as Kendra and I were kind of speaking about earlier, what you decide to do, whether it's a trust, whether it's filling out beneficiary information or other things, it really does depend on your financial situation and what you own and how complicated it is, your financial situation or your desires are, right? And so I think trusts, they do come at a cost. If you do it kind of through a private entity, it's a little bit more expensive and so on. But if you do have a very complex scenario, you own a lot of property, or there's something that's kind of just more complicated about it, you might really want to consider going down the path of a trust, because you can also benefit from getting legal advice, financial, accounting, and other advice associated with it, right? And so I think that's something just to consider. But for people who have a really simple situation where maybe they just own a bank account and that's all they have, and it's under 150,000, and they know clearly who they wanted to give it to, maybe a trust or a will isn't really necessary. So I think it's just something that you want to think through about whether what you have and what your desires are, right? So again, in a scenario where I have a $10,000 bank account, I just want to make sure that, you know, my daughter receives it when I should pass. What I would, since it's under the 150,000 limit and I have nothing else, I could just go to the bank and basically ask to fill out a beneficiary information, basically designating that my daughter would receive it. And after I pass, so long as a death certificate is provided, she'll get that $10,000. And so that's a simple situation where it doesn't involve taking a lot of money to create a trust to do that, right? Similarly, if you own just a home and that's all you really have, there is something that the state law has created called a transfer on death deed. This is actually relatively new. California passed this law in 2016, and it essentially allows people to record a simple document with the recorder's office in your county that basically says who you would like your property to pass on to should you pass. And so again, this is called a transfer on death deed. We're going to include that link on the chat so that you have access to kind of the information about what that requires. But generally, the way that it works is that it's for small properties, so 1 to 4 residential units, condos, agricultural parcels, or single family homes. Generally, the beneficiaries all become co-owners in equal shares. So remember, if you want something super complicated, you want someone to just have 1% of the property and then another to have, you know, 10.5 or other things, the TOD may not be the avenue for you to go. This is a scenario where you're saying, you know what, I have one house, I have one daughter, I want her to have it all. And so you can just simply kind of designate that on a transfer on death deed, get that officially recorded at your local county recorder's office to have it apply. Just like a revocable trust, you can also change your mind with TODs. And so this is something that's important to know, because let's just say, you know, you want to designate to give it to, you know, your daughter, you have a falling out, or perhaps maybe something happened and you change your mind and you want to give your property to someone else. Well, you need to remember to either file a new transfer on death deed. So the most recent one that is filed is going to take precedence. You can also file other documents to basically cancel it. So you can record what is called a revocation form, basically saying I cancel that previous TOD. And or if you sell that property, it essentially kind of takes precedence over that TOD because you no longer essentially own that property. And so we're again going to share the links with you so that you can kind of see what you can do. But it really does depend on this, you know, should I go it alone? Should I just do it by myself? It depends on kind of what it is that your scenario is and whether it's complicated or more complex. And so Kendra, I'd like to ask you to kind of chime in if you've got some thoughts about that as well.
All right. I think the TOD, the transfer on death deed, is a great tool that recently did come out. As long as people are aware that, let's say you have 2 children, adult children, if you're fine with, you know, if one of those kids predeceased you, as long as you're fine with everything going to the remaining child, unless you change your designations on a new TOD deed.
Yep.
If you wanted to make sure that, let's say, a deceased child share went to the children of that deceased child or your grandchildren, then a trust would be more in order. But as long as you're okay with a very straightforward beneficiary designation there, I think it's a great tool and is saving people tens of thousands of dollars in probate fees. So that's something that you can do on your own, along with beneficiary designations on any life insurance, retirement accounts, or other accounts that you have. And I think, once again, it's always good to have a primary beneficiary and then a contingent beneficiary, just in case something happens to that primary beneficiary and you forget to update your paperwork with that entity. You have a contingent choice there to avoid probate. But then we also need to think about, once again, what happens if we become incapacitated. So documents that you can do yourself would be a power of attorney, and you can get some online. As long as they are properly notarized, they would be effective. And once again, I think it's good to have a first choice person and then a second choice person or agent to do limited financial tasks for you. And then the other document that you can prepare yourself would be your healthcare directive and HIPAA. If you are a Kaiser person, they have a pretty good healthcare directive on available to their clients that you can complete. That document can either be notarized by two disinterested people, or can be, witnessed by two disinterested people, or it can be notarized, and then you would turn it back into them. If you're not a Kaiser person, there are other healthcare directives online, and I think it's very smart to spend some time thinking about the different medical scenarios typically described in healthcare directives, and really make sure to take the time now, while you're feeling good and able to do so, to indicate clear instructions about what you would want to happen should you ever be in a coma, should you ever have Alzheimer's. It gives your next tier of people information to go on when they're probably stressed, vulnerable. It's much easier for them to implement your wishes than to try to think of all of the decisions themselves. I will say also with the will, so in Assessor Chu's example, if you were able to put a beneficiary down on an account, handle real property through a transfer on death deed, you can do a simple will, just saying anything else I have, contents in a home or an apartment, will go to whomever or to a charity. But a will, contrary to the other documents I mentioned, a will needs to be witnessed by two disinterested people. And that means that it can't be witnessed by someone receiving something through the will. Just could be neighbors, could be two people at the FedEx store. It just needs to be two disinterested parties witnessing a will. All of the other documents that we've discussed need to be notarized.
Got it. I think it's a good point to make sure that those documents have legal standing. There are requirements like that, witnessing and so on. Can you talk, Kendra, about the pros and cons of having friends or relatives versus a professional be the executor of a trust, for example? So for folks who may not be aware, when you do kind of enact a trust, often you will also be designating someone who is going to execute the wills of or basically the desires of that trust, or what is specified. And so many times people end up asking someone they trust, a family or relative, to do it, but they might also ask a professional to do it. And so Kendra, can you talk a little bit about that?
Absolutely. So in a will or in a trust, or frankly on a power of attorney, you're going to indicate a first choice person or entity to do what you've taken the time to say that you want to have done eventually. So you can choose someone within your circle. It can be a family member, it could be a child, it could be a friend, but I think it's very wise to be honest about the strengths and weaknesses of the people that you are considering. The person indicated either on a power of attorney as the executor of a will or a successor trustee in a trust needs to be good with details and finances. He or she does not need to be your best friend, but it needs to be someone who's going to, again, have follow through and be good with details. If you really don't have someone who you completely trust in that way, it's okay to speak with professional fiduciaries. Typically, those people have gone through some education about how to act as a fiduciary for individuals. I would talk to 3 and see, how you get along with them, and just kind of see their take and assess their experience in having worked as a professional fiduciary. And then for some people, they want their bank to act as a fiduciary. So a bank would act as an executor of a will or as a successor trustee Some banks will act on a power of attorney as an agent, but some will not do so. Banks typically will charge between 2 and 5% of what they're dealing with. So make sure to get their fee structure if you are thinking of using the trust department at your bank. Professional fiduciaries will also charge a fee. They're a little bit less than a bank. And then if you name a friend or a family member, you may want them to have a fee, or you may not want them to have a fee, and that's really up to you. You can indicate whatever you would like. But I think in the nutshell, it's very important to really assess the strengths and weaknesses of the people in your circle if you're thinking of using a friend or a family member. Now with the healthcare agent, that's a completely different skill set to me. It's someone who, if you happen to have a nurse in your family, that's a great choice. I think it's often wise to have someone who's kind of objective, so that when they read your hopefully very detailed healthcare objective, they will implement what you want for yourself. They won't be imposing their wishes upon you, and that they will be strong with medical professionals to make sure that things are taking place in the manner that you would wish.
Yeah, and I will say that I think in particular on advanced healthcare directives, or just generally kind of how you want the process to go, it's often actually a good time to talk to the person who you want to execute that portion about what your desires are. Because I think sometimes it's helpful for people, because when people have to make a decision about your health outcomes, I think that it's often a very weighty thing to put on someone.
It is.
And so and because of that, I think it's really important then to have had kind of clear communications and really have a conversation with people before that time comes, so that they kind of really know that you meant what you said, and they really have a clear idea of it. Because I think I think especially because it's such an emotional thing, it's often a very hard topic. So I've heard that advice as well.
Yes, very good advice. Absolutely. Because it's enough of a burden for them at that stage when they're feeling stressed and vulnerable. So if they're absolutely sure that what you put on your healthcare directive is what you want, it makes them feel strong, and making sure that that is what takes place in a medical setting.
Exactly. So there was a question where someone asked if there was anything that they should be aware of when transferring property to family members, and whether it mattered or not if the transfer happened before or after death, and what was sort of the tax implications one way or the other. So that's a big question. I'm going to take a little bit of, I try to answer a little part of it, and then maybe Kendra, you can follow up with some of the tax implications as well.
Sure.
But I think this is something that I really want to make sure that we spend a little bit of time on here, because I have heard from a number of different people who've come to my office on a couple of occasions. We've heard from a lot of family members, for example, who come in to say, you know what, I'm going to transfer my property because I want to make sure that they don't get reassessed. So I want to give my property to my daughter or to my son because I want them to not have a very high property tax burden as a result of it. And so I just want people to know that in terms of an exclusion, there is currently an exclusion where you're able to pass on your Prop 13 savings to a child if you fill out a form. So that's just something for people to kind of know. And there are restrictions associated with it, but I just want you to know that it doesn't matter whether you actually transfer it when you're alive or if it happens after your death. If your primary home, for example, is passing from you to your child, that entire amount is actually protected with your Prop 13 value if you fill out the parent-to-child exclusion, essentially. And so that actually works both ways. The parent could pass it to the children can also pass it to the parent as well. There is a program that is available if, let's just say, unfortunately, your child predeceases you, but you have grandchildren. There is a program that also allows for a grandparent to pass on the Prop 13 protected value for, say, their primary residence to their grandchildren. But that is not reversible. So a grandchild can't pass it on to their grandparents. So just to know that is a distinction. And again, in both of those instances, it doesn't really matter whether it's happening before or after someone passes away. Why I wanted to spend a little bit of time on this is because we've also heard that we've had some seniors who have come in who have said, you know what, I did this where I passed on and I legally gave my property to my child because I wanted to help them with this tax issue, right? But now they're kicking me out of the home. right? And I thought that they were going to keep me in the home and I'd have a place to live, but now I'm in this bad situation. So I just want people to be aware that if what you're hoping for is to kind of avoid this property tax increase on a reassessment because you're passing it to your children, you think you have to do it before you pass on, it is not the case. It actually can apply. The rules and the law will apply for you so long as the rule is still the rule, right, at that point in time, and the laws don't change. But it is still true whether it's when you pass away or before, and you really do want to be considering and thinking about what protections do you have for the assets, right? And so when you own the home, you have complete control over how you want to use that asset, what you do with it if you sell it. But truly, once you pass it on to your child or someone else, legally they own that property and they can do whatever they want with it. So I just want to put that out there for folks so that you do know that. And so I wonder if, Kendra, you want to add to any of this in terms of taxation impacts?
Yes, and in the same vein, Assessor Chu, another reason to not transfer title to children while you're alive and would want to control the rest of your life would be, and as a lawyer, I need to present this. Let's say you even put your child on as a joint tenant. Let's say that child purchases the minimum auto insurance policy and gets into a wreck where the damages are more than the limits of that policy. If the insurance company or the defendant in a case like that wanted to come against your child's personal assets, your home would be subject to that claim. Let's say your child, and you put your child on a deed either solely or with you, gets a divorce. Even though that was separate property, because you gifted it to that child, you're going to have to spend money and have some very stressful months, if not years, where they're going to discuss if that really truly was separate property of that child and if it's not going to be considered community property in that divorce. So there's really not a good reason to put your child on a deed prematurely. The second big reason as far as taxes go is that if something is conveyed at death rather than during life, you get the market value as of the date of death when they're determining any capital gains implications if that asset is thereafter sold. You don't get that benefit if you have transferred that piece of property while the child is alive. But if it is a transfer that occurs at death, the basis for that property is the fair market value at death. And that could be a huge difference in what you would potentially pay with any capital gains implications.
That's actually a really great point. So Kendra, can I ask clarification? Let's just say that someone decides that they want to transfer the property while they're still alive to, say, their child, right? Is the basis for capital gains the price at which they purchased the property, or is it at the transfer point?
It would be so if they transfer the property to the child, it will be at the time of, well, they inherit the basis of the parent.
Got it.
At that point. So yes, the parent may have done some capital improvements and things like that would increase that base number, but it can be a huge difference than having the position of having the fair market value at death. You know, parents sometimes own homes for 40 years, and that's a huge difference in the Bay Area.
Yeah. So actually, this is an important point for folks to be thinking about. If the person who ends up inheriting the property decides that they're going to want to sell that property at some point in time, you will be subject to something called capital gains tax. And basically what capital gains tax is, they're basically saying, you know, what is the gain that you made on this particular property? And we're going to tax you a certain portion, right? So if you are seeing a transfer occur during the lifetime, so a parent is passing it on, what Kendra is saying is that the basis in which they're calculating that profit essentially, and that you're going to be taxed on, is going to be based on what your parent originally bought that house for. So that basically the basis that your parent had. However, if it gets transferred upon a death, let's just say it happened in January 2020, for example, what happens is that under the federal laws, they reset that basis, basically that bottom part, kind of that differential in which they're going to calculate on that date of transfer. So if your market value of your home happened to be $1 million at that time, they reset it to $1 million for the basis. And let's just say you sell it the next day and it sells for $1 million. Well, they're basically gonna use the basis of $1 million to what you sold it for, and you can see there's no gap, so you probably wouldn't pay much in terms of capital gains taxes there. So that is essentially what Kendra is getting at, this concept of kind of a resetting of the basis for capital gains if you were to sell the property at a future point. Did I kind of describe that correctly, Kendra?
You did, yes.
Okay. Great. And so the next question that we have from folks has to do with making sure that their children inherit as little debt as possible when they die. So are there some tips and some thoughts about how people can kind of put things in order so that does happen?
So essentially, unless your child signed something individually, assuming your debt, that child would not have personal liability on any debt of a parent when that parent passes. Now, if the child is the executor or the trustee of a trust, and there are debts of the estate of the person who passed away, the first duty of that individual, the executor or the successor trustee, is to pay off the debts of the estate before making any distribution. So that's what they need to do. They would wait for bills to come in, make sure to satisfy those bills, and then a distribution could take place after that was taken care of. But that child will not be personally liable for the debts of a parent unless they sign something themselves obligating them to pay those debts.
Got it. That's good to know. This other question that came in was about putting their property into trust. I think we answered this earlier, but just to quickly recap, the question is, if I put my property into trust, do I incur a reassessment, and how do I keep my property ownership anonymous? So a few things, there's two questions there. If I own a property with my husband, let's just say, and then we create a trust and we continue to own the property the same way, typically that would not trigger a reassessment because there has been no change in ownership. So, you know, the ratio of who owns how much doesn't change, and also the people don't change. And so those are things that we look for in terms of determining whether something is triggering a reassessment. Again, is, are they the same people who are owning it, and are they owning it in the same proportion, right? So those are just things to keep in mind. The second question is about how to keep your property ownership anonymous. And so I think just one thing to know is that under state law, part of my office is also the recorder function. And so the recorder function essentially is the entity that maintains all public records when it comes to deeds and sales or purchases of property. And that's really important because if we didn't have a credible kind of source of information about all ownership information, you really couldn't sell or verify that anyone owned anything, right? And so it's really important that we have a very clear chain of ownership so that we know when someone is selling you something that they actually legally have the right to sell that thing to you. And so as a result, people do ask, you know, can I keep my ownership anonymous? Unfortunately, those records are public records, and it can be searchable, and people can look that information up. And in fact, when title companies often kind of do transactions for home transactions, they typically are looking up records in our office to ensure that that chain of ownership is right and it's clean. There are times when people try to put documents or put property into kind of entities, legal entities and others. Just know that that information is also potentially searchable in a state database. So I think ultimately, ownership information is supposed to be public records receivable. People can actually find that information out. And so just kind of information for folks to be aware of. So Annie has popped back on. That's our cue that the question and answer session is going to start soon. And so I'm going to just end in terms of our submitted questions to Kendra. There's a question that says, where can I find help to set up an estate plan quickly?
Okay, several of the things that we've discussed today can be done rather quickly. If you have accounts, if you have retirement accounts, if you have life insurance, if you contact that entity, ask them to send you your beneficiary designation form, review that. If it doesn't have a contingent beneficiary, add one. Typically you have to notarize those and send it back to that that entity that is holding that policy or those accounts, that can be done within a week. You can also pull down a healthcare directive from your medical establishment. You can indicate preferences there, have them notarized, give that notarized document back to your medical professionals. That could be done relatively quickly too. A transfer on death deed also can be properly executed and filed. Doing a will or a trust may take a little bit more time. I would say it's typically a couple of weeks. Our office does them on that timeline. It's usually 2 to 3 weeks or so to meet with people. And nowadays, of course, it's virtual, to prepare drafts, to adequately review those drafts with clients, and then get around to signing them with our notary and witnesses. So, so some of it could be done on your own. Doing a will or a trust with a lawyer is going to take, several weeks, I would say.
And also, just for folks to know, HERA is a nonprofit organization providing these services at a sliding scale. So again, we just want to make sure that people have access to kind of financial help that's available out there, in particular for many of our nonprofit partners who do assist folks. So Annie, may I turn it over to you?
Yes, please. We have so many questions coming in. I'm sorry we were not going to be able to get to all of them on time, but we will definitely reach out to you afterwards to follow up. We have a question from Connie. Connie says, two single person bought a house with 45% and 55% separately. After being married for 2 years, they did not change the title. But now the husband wants to transfer his 45% to his wife. Will that change on the property tax? What will they need to do?
So my understanding is that transfers are basically kind of sharing of ownership information between husband and wife are different, or for married couples are different. And so in that situation, we wouldn't expect a reassessment to happen there.
Right. And if they did want to now create a marital trust, now that they are married, they could not do so prior to marriage. They could do that, own their property together as community property within that marital trust. There are some benefits for married couples in owning property as community property in a marital trust. Essentially, if they own property as community property and one of them passes away, if that property is thereafter sold, even though both of them haven't passed, that surviving spouse will once again get that full step up in basis that I discussed earlier. So that's a very unique thing for people who own property as community property.
So that's something that is, I'm glad that Kendra brought that up. And so I think, if you're like me, when you first bought a home, you were not really paying attention to all of these legal documents, nor did you really know what they really were, right? But you just knew that you had to kind of fill them out. So one thing that I really do suggest that you take a look at, in particular for properties, because it's usually such a big part of what we own, take a look at your deed and how it is that you have recorded holding title. Right. And so you're going to see on that line, there's actually very specific legal language that speaks to how people are owning things. And not only that, but what is the right of survivorship afterwards. And so, for example, you're going to see on some deeds where it's going to say, Carmen Chu and my husband, right, we own the property as community property. So, kind of speaking to what Kendra is saying, the designation of my deed is actually saying how we're owning this property. But let's just say that, I purchased my property with my partner. He wasn't my husband yet, but we kind of own a property together, right? It might have been that we ended up opening it as tenants in common. So we each have a real proportionate share, and maybe it also designate that there is no rights to survivorship, right? And that would essentially be saying that I own my 50% share, he owns his 50% share, right? If I were to pass away, my 50% share, unless I designated it somehow with a TOD, or if I had put up a trust or a will or something that designated it, it would have to go through a probate process for who would likely be in the chain of inheritance for me. Because even though we bought the property together, I'm designating in my deed that we're owning our separate portions of it, right? And that he doesn't have a right to receive my portion if I should pass away. So I would just recommend, because I think especially when we first buy property, sometimes it's such a blur with all the things that are happening that you don't pay attention to the language that is in your deed. You might want to just pull that document up and see what it says, because it speaks to not only how you're owning it, but what happens in terms of survivorship and where that property passes afterwards.
Very good point, Assessor Shu. And I will say that for people who purchased property prior to about 2000 or so, a lot of people were taking title as joint tenants with their spouse. And if it's held as joint tenants without a right of survivorship and without being community property, once again, I believe that if one of them passed and then it was thereafter sold, they would only get the step up in basis on that 50% rather than the 100% as if they had owned it as community property with a right of survivorship. So it's very important to pull out those old deeds. I see deeds indicating all kinds of things, and it's very simple to change as long as both people are alive and everyone has the proper legal capacity. So that's a great tip. Well, all of us have a little bit more free time, pull out that old grant deed.
Right. Annie?
Yes, so we have one last question. It is now 12:55. So let's ask one more sorry to everyone again. We'll have one more question and we'll go back to the rest of you after the webinar. So the last question is, let's see, there's so many to choose from. Should we put a trust name or actual beneficiary, for example, a child, on the beneficiary form?
Of a retirement account or on a life insurance policy?
Yeah, they did not specify. This is from
Okay.
Wendy.
Okay,
Can you read that again, Annie? Sorry.
Yeah, of course. Should we put a trust name or actual beneficiaries, for example, children, on the beneficiary form?
Oh, got it.
So you can put someone down as the primary beneficiary. If the child is a responsible adult, you could put that child down as a beneficiary. And I don't know how old this person's child or children are. If those children are younger, you have to think about, if you just put someone's name down on a beneficiary form, that person would obtain that asset at age 18. We can all think about being age 18, and if we all of a sudden came into a sum of money, that might be the best thing for us. So if you have younger children or just children who aren't that financially responsible yet, you can put a trust down as a beneficiary, and then certain restrictions that we will have in the trust. For instance, that money would only be used for health, education support, and maintenance until someone is 30 years old or 25 years old, meaning that the child would have living expenses, could attend school, but would not receive the checkbook until age 25 or 30. That would be an instance when you would put the name of a trust down on a beneficiary designation form, when you want those assets, the distribution of those assets, to be controlled.
Yeah, and I think that's a great point to sort of wrap up with, which is, again, I think each one of the different tools that we've talked about today, whether it's a will, a trust, just designating beneficiaries, a TOD, it really does depend on kind of who you're passing it on to, what are your wishes, how complex things are. Because I think, as Kendra mentioned now, if your beneficiary, the intended beneficiary, is someone who is 5 years old versus 30, it's maybe a different consideration that you're going to want to have and how you want to set that up. And I do know that with trust, there are a lot of there's more flexibility in terms of being able to designate conditions in which that person would be cared for until they're of the age that you think that they should inherit or receive kind of full ownership rights of the property or asset. So many things to consider and think about. I hope that we've given people a lot of food for thought and kind of an initial place to begin thinking about these questions. And I think for sure, Kendra and Hera and other entities do have resources to kind of help you wade through some of those questions and processes as you move forward. So Kendra, is there anything else that you'd like to add before we wrap up?
In discussing children, because I really didn't have time to get into that, people with young children under the age of 18, they should probably prepare at least a will. If they own a home, they can, of course, prepare a trust as well. But in those documents, you would typically designate who you want to be the guardian of your children should you pass away. And once again, this avoids a lot of chaos between well-intentioned family members who really think they would be best. It's best if you've made that decision very, very clear, because a court often gives great deference to that choice.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, I want to thank you, Kendra, for joining us and for closing on that remark, because I think it just really drives home the point that when we talk about estate planning, it's really a document that is love. right? It's about like, how do I take care of the people who survive me, and how do I make sure that they are set up in a good way, that they don't have to kind of assume burdens or things without kind of clear understanding about where you want things to go. And I think, especially as you mentioned, especially for young children as well, making sure that you know, who you think are the best kind of guardians and folks to take care of them are actually going to be the ones who can. So I think that's really important. So thank you again, Kendra, for spending time with us, and for all of the panelists who have joined us, for SFG TV for broadcasting it, to my team at the Assessor Recorder's Office for all of your hard work, and of course to our translator for making sure that everything is accessible to our participants. We hope that you learned a lot. Thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much, Assessor Chu and Kendra again. I just want to remind folks that we are going to put up the poll one more time so that you can take this opportunity to give us feedback in regards to our first digital Family Wealth Forum. Thank you so much for joining us on this Saturday afternoon. We hope that you will stay well and enjoy the rest of your weekend. Bye-bye.
Goodbye.